There are men who move through history like a blade through water, fast, precise, and leaving almost nothing undisturbed on the surface. You would not know them from a photograph, you would not recognize them in a crowd, and yet the ground they crossed remembers them. The towns they burned through remember them. The families who lost someone on a frozen Belgian road in the winter of 1944, they remember them. Joachim Peiper was one of those men. He was not a general who commanded from a distance, safe behind maps and telephone lines. He was not a politician who issued orders in clean language from a warm room. He was the man in the lead tank. He was the voice on the radio pushing his column harder, faster, deeper into territory that common sense said to avoid. He was 29 years old when he led one of the most feared armoured spearheads in the entire German military, and he would spend the rest of his life answering for what that column did. This is not a story about a hero. It is not a story about a monster, either, though monstrosity was present. It is something more complicated than either of those labels allows. It is the story of a young man who chose a side, committed completely to that choice, and then watched the world he had given everything to collapse in fire and snow around him. It is the story of what happens when talent and ideology fuse into something dangerous. And it is the story of justice, partial, contested, and never quite complete, that followed him across 3 decades until the night a house in France went up in flames. If you are settling in tonight, finding your comfortable position, letting the weight of the day begin to lift, good, stay with us. This one reaches back to the rubble of Weimar Germany, all the way to the Ardennes forest in the dead of winter, and forward still into the long, strange aftermath that followed the Second World War. It is one of the most layered, most debated stories to emerge from that entire conflict, and most people have never heard the full version. Tonight we are going to tell it. We are going to trace the arc of a life that began in Berlin in 1915, in a Germany already bent and broken by the First World War, already soaking in the bitterness and confusion that would make the rise of the Nazi Party possible. We will follow Peiper from schoolboy to SS recruit, from parade grounds to the frozen earth of the Eastern Front, where men aged 10 years in a single winter. We will walk beside him through the grinding carnage of Kharkov and Kursk, through the long, humiliating retreat westward that no German soldier wanted to admit was happening. And then we will arrive at December of 1944, which is where this story finds its darkest center of gravity. The Ardennes Offensive, the operation the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's final throw of the dice in the West. Hitler believed a bold armoured thrust through the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg could shatter the Allied front, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and buy the Reich enough time and leverage to negotiate something other than total defeat. It was, by almost any strategic measure, a desperate idea. But desperate ideas, when backed by enough steel and belief, can travel a long way before they finally stop. Peiper's column was the sharpest point of that thrust. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, infantry, all of it moving at night, moving fast, moving with the particular reckless confidence of a commander who had survived the Eastern Front and believed that speed itself was armor. For a brief window of days, it worked. The American lines buckled. The fog kept Allied aircraft grounded. The roads, narrow, icy, winding through villages most people had never heard of, became corridors through which Peiper drove his force like a fist. But on the 17th of December, something happened near a crossroads outside the Belgian town of Malmedy that would echo far beyond the battle itself. American prisoners, soldiers who had already surrendered, who were no longer combatants, were killed by soldiers under Peiper's command, roughly 80 men, in a field, in the snow. That incident, known ever after as the Malmedy Massacre, became one of the most documented and most debated war crimes of the entire Western campaign. It followed Peiper to the prisoner of war camps. It followed him to the Dachau courtroom where he stood trial in 1946. It followed him through years of appeals, through the commutation of his death sentence, through his release in 1956, and into the quiet civilian life he tried to build for himself in the years that followed. It never stopped following him. We will look honestly at what happened at Malmedy, what the evidence shows, where the uncertainties remain, and why the question of individual command responsibility is both necessary and genuinely difficult. We will examine the trial itself, which became controversial for reasons that had nothing to do with Peiper's innocence, and which raised hard questions about the standards of military justice in the immediate post-war years. None of that complexity erases the dead in the field, but it does demand that we look carefully rather than reach for easy conclusions. Because that is what this documentary asks of you, not to reach for easy conclusions, not to file a man neatly into the folder marked hero or villain and move on, but to sit with the full weight of a life, the talent and the crime, the discipline and the cruelty, the survivability and the ultimate, unanswerable reckoning. Some of you watching tonight are already familiar with the name. Perhaps you have read about the Ardennes. Perhaps you have seen Peiper's name in a book about SS commanders or war crimes trials. If so, you know how complicated the account can get, how quickly different writers arrive at different conclusions depending on which facts they emphasize. What we have tried to do here is something simpler and more demanding at the same time. We have tried to follow the timeline honestly. We have tried to let the history speak without forcing it toward a verdict it has not yet fully delivered. We have also tried to make this something you can actually rest with, long, measured, thorough in the way a winter night is thorough, the kind of storytelling that lets you close your eyes and still follow the thread. If you have not already, now is the time to settle in. Adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop, let the day's noise move a little further away. The story of Joachim Peiper begins long before the tanks and the snow and the burning houses of the Ardennes. It begins in a fractured country, looking for someone to believe in, and in a boy who found, in the ordered rows of a new and terrible movement, exactly the belonging he had been searching for. That boy would become one of the most capable and most condemned armored commanders of the Second World War. And tonight, from beginning to end, we are going to understand how. Berlin, in the summer of 1915, was a city holding its breath. The Great War had been grinding across Europe for almost a year, consuming men and material at a rate that no government had dared predict when the guns first fired. The German capital wore the early signs of strain. Food queues stretching around corners, women in dark clothing moving through streets that had been full of uniformed men only months before, newspapers proclaiming victories that felt increasingly hollow against the weight of casualty lists posted outside post offices and municipal buildings. Into this world, on the 30th of January, a boy was born to Waldemar Peiper, a former army officer, and his wife Charlotte. They named him Joachim, a strong biblical name carrying a certain gravity, and in doing so, they handed him an identity that would take decades and a world war to fully define. The family was respectable, middle class, and deeply shaped by the values of Wilhelmine Germany, duty, order, and the belief that Germany's place in the world was one of earned greatness. Those values, already under severe pressure from the realities of industrial warfare, would face total collapse before the boy could finish primary school. the Germany into which Joachim Peiper took his first steps as a child ceased to exist before he was old enough to understand what had been lost. The armistice of November 1918 ended the fighting, but opened wounds that proved far deeper and more durable than any artillery barrage. For a boy growing up in a household shaped by military tradition, the national humiliation of defeat was not an abstraction heard on the radio. It was something he absorbed through the atmosphere of his home, through the way adults spoke in lowered voices about the terms of the peace settlement and what it meant for Germany's future. The Treaty of Versailles stripped the country of territory, imposed crippling financial reparations, and, perhaps most psychologically damaging of all, placed the entire blame for the war on Germany's shoulders. To Peiper's generation, raised in families that had believed in the righteousness of the German cause, this verdict felt like a deliberate wound designed not merely to punish, but to humiliate and diminish. Children are perceptive receivers of adult emotion, and the emotional register of those years in Germany was one of grievance, confusion, and barely suppressed fury. The Weimar Republic, born from the ashes of military defeat and imperial collapse, was not a system that inspired confident loyalty in most of the Germans who lived under it. It was a democracy assembled in crisis, perpetually under attack from both the radical left and the nationalist right, and it never quite managed to achieve the stable legitimacy that might have allowed ordinary citizens to trust it. Economic catastrophe arrived in successive waves. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s reduced middle-class savings to near worthlessness almost overnight, and the images of Germans carrying wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread became emblematic of a system that seemed fundamentally incapable of protecting its own people. For a family like the Peipers, whose identity was tied to the military virtues of the old order, and whose financial security depended on predictable social structures, these years were personally damaging in ways that went beyond mere inconvenience. Waldemar Peiper had served his country as an officer and believed in the institutions of Germany. Watching those institutions dissolve into chaos and political street fighting must have communicated something powerful to his son about the fragility of order and the cost of its absence. The Great Depression, arriving at the end of the 1920s, applied a second devastating blow to a republic already struggling to breathe, driving unemployment to catastrophic levels and pushing millions of desperate Germans toward political movements that promised clarity and purpose in place of drift and failure. Young Joachim was, by most accounts, an intelligent and physically capable boy, the kind who excelled in the structured environments that rewarded discipline and application. He attended school during years when the classroom could not fully insulate students from the turmoil outside its walls. Teachers discussed politics with unmistakable ideological coloring. Peer groups formed along lines of loyalty to competing youth movements, and the ordinary adolescent desire for belonging carried unusual political stakes. He was not a boy growing up in comfortable, prosperous certainty. He was growing up in a Germany that felt perpetually on the edge of something, where strength seemed to offer more security than doubt, and where the institutions of the old world had demonstrably failed to protect the people who had trusted them. His father's military background gave him a framework for understanding the world in terms of hierarchy, command, and earned respect, values that mapped poorly onto the chaotic pluralism of Weimar political life, but would find a receptive home in the disciplined structures that were beginning to emerge on Germany's political right. The Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend, was not simply a political organization. For the boys who joined it in the late 1920s and early 1930s, it offered something that transcended ideology, at least in its initial appeal. It offered belonging, physical challenge, and the intoxicating sense of being part of something larger and more purposeful than the confused individual. The organization provided camping trips and physical training, marching and competition, camaraderie, and the ritual satisfaction of uniform, rank, and shared identity. For a boy of Peiper's temperament, drawn to order, physically capable, and surrounded by a culture of military tradition, the Hitler Youth would have offered genuine appeal quite apart from its political content. But the political content was always present, woven into every song and every speech, gradually replacing the complexity of moral judgment with the seductive simplicity of ideological certainty. Germany was great. Germany had been betrayed. Germany would rise again. These were the propositions a boy absorbed not through formal instruction alone, but through the lived experience of marching, competing, and belonging to a movement that told him he mattered, that his people mattered, and that the suffering of the past had an explanation and a solution. Peiper's adolescence unfolded during the years when the National Socialist movement was transforming from a radical fringe into a genuine mass political force. By the early 1930s, the streets of German cities were regularly contested between competing paramilitaries. Election results swung violently between extremes, and the Weimar government's authority visibly disintegrated. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January of 1933, coincidentally the very month of Peiper's 18th birthday, Germany crossed a threshold from which there would be no easy return. The transformation of the Republic into a one-party state moved with a speed that surprised even many of those who had enabled it, and for young men already inside the organizational structures of National Socialism, this consolidation of power confirmed everything they had been told. Their movement had been right. Their faith had been rewarded. The nation was healing, order was returning, and they stood at its vanguard. To understand Peiper is not to excuse him, but it is essential to understand the particular gravity of the world that shaped him during his most formative years. He was not born a war criminal. He was born a German boy in a time of extraordinary national crisis, into a family that valued military virtue, in a culture that was actively searching for someone to blame for its humiliation, and something to believe in beyond parliamentary chaos and economic despair. The ideology he encountered in the Hitler Youth did not arrive as a transparent program of hatred. It arrived dressed in the language of national renewal, masculine purpose, and earned pride. The darkness at its core was present from the beginning, but it was a darkness that took years to fully reveal itself, and by the time it did, the young men who had grown up inside the movement were already deeply committed, their identities inseparable from the institutions and beliefs that had formed them. By the time Peiper came of age in the early 1930s, his trajectory was effectively set. He was physically fit, intellectually capable, drawn to hierarchy and discipline, loyal to a movement that had given him belonging and purpose during the most psychologically turbulent years of his life, and embedded in a culture that treated military service as the highest expression of masculine worth. Germany around him was changing at an astonishing pace. New institutions were being built, old ones dismantled, and the opportunities available to a young man who fit the physical and ideological profile of the new order were genuinely significant. He had grown up watching his father's generation fail, watching the institutions of the old Germany collapse under the pressure of war and its aftermath. The new Germany was promising something different: strength, clarity, and the restoration of a national dignity that he had been told was rightfully Germany's. There is a particular kind of tragedy in the early chapters of a life like this, not the tragedy of misfortune arriving from outside, but the tragedy of a capable mind shaped by forces that directed its energy and loyalty toward catastrophic ends. The boy in Berlin, seeking order in a fractured world, would find it. He would find it in the shining corridors of one of the Third Reich's most elite institutions, in the precise rituals of military life, in the particular satisfaction of command and tactical mastery. What he could not yet see, what none of them could fully see, was the price that would eventually be demanded in return for that sense of order and belonging. The world was about to make very clear the cost of the bargain he had made, and the making of the soldier was only just beginning. Germany in 1935 was a nation in the grip of transformation. The wreckage of the Weimar Republic had been swept aside with startling speed, replaced by something harder, louder, and far more certain of itself. The streets of Berlin, the city where Joachim Peiper had been born 20 years earlier, no longer carried the same air of exhausted shame that had defined the Republic's final years. Flags flew from every public building, rallies filled the stadiums. The language of defeat had been replaced by the language of destiny. For a young man shaped by disorder and humiliation, the new Germany offered something intoxicating, a sense that the chaos had been conquered, that someone had finally imposed a shape upon the wreckage. Peiper, 20 years old and already alert to questions of status and belonging, was watching all of it very carefully. The path he chose in that year was not an ordinary one. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, was no longer the small bodyguard unit it had been in the 1920s. By 1935, Heinrich Himmler had transformed it into something altogether different, a parallel power structure within the Nazi state, an organization that positioned itself above the regular army, above the police, above every institution that had once defined German authority. To join the SS was not merely to sign an enlistment form. It was a declaration of intent, a statement that a young man wished to place himself at the very center of the new order. The standards for entry were severe, or at least presented as such. Physical examinations, racial documentation reaching back multiple generations, the performance of an identity that had been carefully constructed to seem like destiny. For Peiper, meeting those standards was not a burden, it was the point. What drew a young man in 1935 toward an organization like this deserves honest examination, because the easy answer, that he was simply a true believer, risks flattening the complexity of how ideology actually works on a 20-year-old. Peiper had grown up watching his country unravel. He had seen veterans of the First War begging in the streets. He had watched the currency collapse, the democratic institutions bicker themselves into irrelevance, the communists and the nationalists fight each other in the gutters of German cities. The Weimar Republic had offered young men like him very little: a fragmented country, an uncertain future, and the lingering national wound of a war that had supposedly been lost not on the battlefield, but through betrayal at home. The Nazi movement offered a completely opposite narrative, one in which Germany's humiliation was not permanent, in which a new generation could reclaim what had been stolen. To a young man searching for purpose and structure, that narrative had an almost gravitational pull. But Peiper did not simply join the SS. He was selected for the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal guard regiment. This was a distinction that mattered enormously, both practically and symbolically. The Leibstandarte was the crown jewel of Himmler's organization, the unit that stood closest to power, that wore the most visible insignia, that drilled with the kind of precision calculated to project absolute strength. Entry into the Leibstandarte was not guaranteed by enthusiasm alone. It required physical height, bearing, youth, and the appearance of everything the regime claimed to be building: a new aristocracy of blood and discipline. Peiper possessed all of these qualities on the surface, and the surface was very much what the Leibstandarte was designed to project. He stepped across a threshold that most young Germans would never even approach, and he did so at the age when ambition and idealism are most easily fused into something indistinguishable from each other. The Leibstandarte was not simply a ceremonial unit, though ceremony was surely part of its function in those early years. It trained for war with the seriousness of an organization that believed war was coming, because it was. Recruits were pushed through physical conditioning that filtered out the merely willing and retained only those capable of sustained performance under stress. They learned the mechanics of armored vehicles and infantry tactics, studied military history through the lens the regime had constructed for it, and absorbed a culture that placed collective identity and absolute loyalty far above individual moral judgment. Peiper thrived in this environment. His intelligence was evident to those who evaluated him. His physical capability was not in question, and his willingness to subordinate himself to the institution, at least for now, marked him as exactly the kind of officer material the SS was working to develop. There is something worth pausing on here, in this moment before the wars begin. The institution Peiper had joined was already, by 1935, responsible for running the concentration camp system that had emerged in the years following the Nazi seizure of power. The SS did not hide this function from its members. Dachau, established in 1933, was administered under SS authority from its earliest days. Joining the SS in 1935 meant joining an organization whose involvement in political imprisonment and brutality was not a secret but a structure. How much a 20-year-old officer candidate processed this, how much he understood or chose not to understand, is impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that it did not stop him. The machinery of the new Germany included that machinery as a functioning part, and Peiper placed himself inside it. His advancement within the Leibstandarte came with notable speed. His superiors recognized qualities in him that the organization valued: quickness of mind, physical confidence, and an impatience with hesitation that would later define his battlefield style. He was not a soldier who waited for clarity. He moved toward problems rather than away from them, and in an institution that rewarded aggression as a default posture, this made him conspicuous in the best way. By his early to middle 20s, he was already marked for greater responsibility, and those who noted his progress spoke of him in terms that mixed genuine tactical respect with a recognition that he embodied what the Leibstandarte was trying to manufacture at scale: the officer who never doubted, never slowed, and never looked back. The culture inside the SS Leibstandarte deserves its own consideration, because it was not simply a military culture, it was a total environment, one that shaped how its members understood themselves, their enemies, and their obligations. The bonds formed inside a unit like this operated at a level beneath formal ideology. They were the bonds of shared hardship, shared identity, and the particular loyalty that forms when a group of young men are made to believe they are different from everyone outside the fence. Peiper was immersed in this from the beginning. The friendships he formed, the hierarchies he navigated, the values he absorbed, all of it took place inside an institution that had constructed a complete moral universe of its own, one in which the outside world's ethical frameworks had been deliberately replaced with something else. By the time the first shots were fired in Europe, he had lived inside that universe for 4 years. In 1936, Himmler arranged for Peiper to serve for a period as his own adjutant, a posting that placed the young officer within the administrative heart of the SS itself. This was not a battlefield assignment. It was a window into power, a seat at the table where the organizational decisions of the entire SS apparatus were made and communicated. Peiper spent time in close proximity to a man who was, by that point, one of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich, watching how that power was exercised, what language it used, what priorities it maintained. Whether this posting deepened Peiper's ideological commitment or simply expanded his understanding of how the institution functioned is a question without a clean answer. What it almost surely did was sharpen his ambition and give him a perspective on the SS that few officers his age possessed. By the time he returned to line command, to the armored units and tactical responsibilities that would define the rest of his military career, Peiper was no longer simply a promising recruit. He was a young officer who had been close to the center, who understood the organization from the inside out, and who had made a series of choices, each one smaller than it felt in the moment, that had carried him to a place from which there was no straightforward path back. The ideology was not something separate from his career, a backdrop against which he happened to serve. It was woven through every promotion, every selection, every posting. To be inside the SS Leibstandarte in 1935, 1936, 1937 was to participate in the construction of something, whether or not a young man paused long enough to ask what, exactly, was being built. The step Joachim Peiper took at 20 years old was described by the regime as a calling, a higher service, a selection of the worthy by history itself. The language was designed to make it feel inevitable, predestined, the logical conclusion of everything a young man of his background and temperament had been moving toward. That framing served the SS well. It gave its members a way to understand their enlistment not as a choice with consequences, but as a recognition of who they already were. Peiper accepted that framing. He wore it as naturally as the uniform, and in accepting it, he closed the door on certain other versions of himself that might otherwise have existed, versions that never entered this particular building, never signed this particular form, never stood in this particular line, and been found acceptable by these particular men. The door closed quietly, the way such doors always do, and the young soldier on the other side of it began to move forward. He had trained for this. Every early morning formation, every field exercise in the chill of Brandenburg air, every hour spent learning the doctrine of mobile warfare, it had all been pointed, without sentiment, toward a moment like this. When German armored columns crossed the Polish frontier in the first days of September 1939, Joachim Peiper was 23 years old, a junior officer of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and the war he had been groomed to fight had finally arrived. He was not yet a commander in the fullest sense. He was still a man learning what it meant to lead other men towards something that could kill them all. But the learning would be swift, and the lessons would leave permanent marks. The invasion of Poland was the Reich's first true test of a military doctrine that had been refined on paper and in training grounds across Germany for years. The concept was one of coordinated violence at speed, armored vehicles, artillery, and air power working in concert to paralyze an enemy before it could organize a coherent response. For a young officer like Peiper, assigned to armored reconnaissance duties, the invasion placed him at the sharpest point of that concept. Reconnaissance was not a passive role. It demanded the ability to move forward into unknown territory, to assess enemy strength under fire, and to bring back information that commanders could act on before circumstances changed. It required a particular kind of nerve, measured aggression married to tactical intelligence, and Peiper possessed both in conspicuous quantity. The Polish army fought with genuine courage against a mechanized enemy that had been structured to overcome exactly the kind of defense Warsaw could mount. Polish cavalry, infantry formations, and artillery units resisted in places with a ferocity that surprised German planners who had expected faster collapse. But the structural mismatch was severe. German armor moved faster than Polish command could respond. Orders arrived at Polish headquarters, describing situations that had already changed by the time those orders could be transmitted back down the chain. In this environment of perpetual catch-up, German spearhead units like the one Peiper operated with could exploit gaps almost as fast as they created them. The tempo of the campaign was not simply a tactical advantage, it was a psychological weapon applied at every level simultaneously. Peiper moved through this campaign absorbing information that no classroom could replicate. He studied the relationship between terrain and vehicle performance in real conditions, under actual fire, with the clock running. He observed which decisions cost time and which ones bought it. He noted the way that hesitation, any hesitation, allowed an enemy to recover equilibrium and transform a rout into a fight. His own conduct in the reconnaissance role reflected what he was learning. He pushed forward, gathered what his commanders needed, and returned to report before opportunity closed. Senior officers began to notice not just his courage, which was common enough in the SS, but his ability to act with purpose when information was incomplete. That combination was considerably rarer. The campaign lasted roughly 5 weeks from the crossing of the frontier to the capitulation of the last organized Polish forces. In historical terms, it was brief. In the experience of the men who fought it on the ground, those 5 weeks compressed an enormous amount of violence, exhaustion, confusion, and death into a span of time that felt simultaneously endless and brutally short. Peiper experienced the physical reality of armored warfare for the first time. The noise, the mechanical breakdowns, the dust and mud that clogged equipment, the disorientation of moving through territory that maps described only approximately. He encountered the chaos that sits between a commander's intention and what actually happens when soldiers and machines enter contact with a resisting enemy. He learned to function inside that chaos, rather than waiting for it to resolve. What is documented about his conduct in Poland is that it drew favorable attention from officers whose professional judgments shaped careers within the SS. He was recognized as a soldier who combined physical toughness with operational thinking, a man who could endure the discomforts of the field without losing the clarity that his duties demanded. These were not small attributes in an organization that placed enormous weight on performance under pressure. The SS Leibstandarte was an elite formation that measured itself by standards above those applied to ordinary Wehrmacht units. And within that demanding environment, Peiper's trajectory began to rise. He received promotion, and with promotion came expanded responsibilities that would carry him forward into the next phase of Germany's war. Before the Soviet Union entered the picture, there was France. In the spring of 1940, German forces executed a campaign through the Low Countries and across northern France that stunned both the Allied armies and much of the watching world. Peiper participated in this campaign as the Leibstandarte moved through Belgium and drove toward the Channel coast. The French campaign moved even faster than Poland had, and the armoured operations that defined it were more complex and more demanding on their participants. For Peiper, this was another layer of education, another set of conditions under which to test the instincts and habits he was developing as an officer. The campaign ended in German triumph, but it also confirmed for those paying attention that the character of modern war had changed permanently. Speed, coordination, and the willingness to accept risk were now the currencies that mattered most. By the time the Leibstandarte was redeployed and refitted for operations in Greece and Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, Peiper had accumulated a breadth of field experience that few officers his age could claim. These Balkan campaigns added further texture to his understanding of how German armor could be applied against different kinds of terrain and opposition. The mountains and valleys of the Balkans presented conditions unlike Poland or France: narrower roads, steeper gradients, defensive positions that used geography more effectively. Adapting to those conditions required flexibility and the ability to solve problems with the assets immediately available, rather than waiting for ideal circumstances. Peiper demonstrated both qualities consistently enough that his reputation among senior officers continued to solidify. It is worth pausing here to consider what was being shaped by these experiences and what was not. The campaigns of 1939 through 1941 were producing a technically proficient, tactically aggressive, and personally courageous officer. They were also producing a man who was being formed entirely within an ideological system that systematically excluded moral consideration of the enemy and of civilian populations from its operational culture. The SS was not a conventional military organization that happened to hold political views. It was a political organization that had militarized itself, and its relationship to violence existed within a framework that ordinary professional armies did not share. Peiper was not an innocent professional soldier who happened to wear the wrong uniform. He was a product of an institution whose values he had consciously chosen, and those values were present in every theater he served in, operating beneath the surface of the tactical decisions that were making his name. The notice he received from senior commanders was genuine and earned in the military sense. His technical skills were real. His physical courage under fire was documented and consistent. But the professional world in which those qualities were being recognized and rewarded was one in which certain questions were never asked. About what was happening to civilians in the wake of advancing columns, about what orders were flowing through the command structure that had nothing to do with defeating enemy soldiers on a battlefield. These questions would eventually demand answers in a courtroom far in the future. In the autumn of 1939 and the spring campaigns that followed, they remained unasked, and the young officer collecting his commendations had no reason yet to imagine they would ever come. His reputation going into the summer of 1941 was therefore a specific kind of reputation, one built in conditions that had not yet fully tested every dimension of what he was. He was considered a hard soldier, a capable leader, technically sophisticated, and personally brave. These assessments were accurate as far as they went. What the Ardennes of Poland, the flat roads of France, and the mountains of the Balkans had not yet shown was how a man behaves when the campaign stops going well, when the resources run dry, and when the pressure to produce results collides with circumstances that make results impossible. That test was coming, and it bore a name that would darken everything in its path: the Eastern Front, vast and indifferent, where the scale of destruction would exceed anything Peiper or almost anyone else in the German military had yet encountered. The officer who rode east in the summer of 1941 was hardened and accomplished by the standards of his world. What that world was about to ask of him was something else entirely. The summer of 1941 arrived with a violence that Europe had never witnessed before. In the early hours of the 22nd of June, along a front stretching roughly 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The roar of artillery preceded them, and the sky above the borderlands filled with smoke before the sun had fully risen. This was Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in the history of warfare, and Joachim Peiper, now 25 years old and already a seasoned soldier, moved east with it. For a man who had spent years refining his understanding of mechanized warfare across the plains of Poland and the grinding campaigns that preceded this moment, the Soviet frontier represented something entirely new. The sheer scale of what lay ahead was almost incomprehensible, even to those who had studied it on maps. Peiper's regiment moved with the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, as part of Army Group South, pushing into Ukraine with the speed and confidence that early German successes seemed to justify. In those first weeks, the advance was intoxicating. Soviet defensive lines buckled and collapsed with startling regularity, and entire Red Army formations were encircled in massive pockets that yielded hundreds of thousands of prisoners. German armor cut through terrain that military theorists had considered impassable, and the illusion of a swift, total victory seemed entirely plausible. Peiper led his men with the assertiveness that had already drawn admiring attention from his superiors, pressing forward when other officers slowed, exploiting gaps with the instincts of someone who had come to read mobile warfare the way a musician reads notation. The roads east unrolled before them like an open hand. Yet almost from the beginning, the Eastern Front announced its character in unmistakable terms. The distances involved were not merely large, they were psychologically consuming. A soldier advancing west had familiar coordinates to anchor him. Here, the horizon simply continued, day after day, offering no natural endpoint, no familiar landmark to suggest that the journey was finite. Supply lines stretched to breaking point almost immediately, and men who had grown accustomed to the relative order of earlier campaigns found themselves fighting in conditions that had no precedent in their experience. The roads, such as they were, turned to mud when rain came, swallowing wheeled vehicles whole. The heat of a Ukrainian summer gave way to the first suggestions of something far worse waiting on the other side of autumn. Nothing in Peiper's previous service had fully prepared him for the scale of what the Soviet Union was willing to absorb. The fighting itself evolved rapidly from the open engagements of those early weeks into something far more intimate and punishing. Soviet units that had been bypassed or surrounded did not simply surrender and wait. They fought on, disrupting supply columns, attacking rear formations, and creating the terrifying sensation that the front existed everywhere simultaneously. Peiper experienced combat in its most disorienting form, fluid, non-linear, and without reliable boundaries between safe ground and contested ground. His tactical instincts, developed in the more structured engagements of the Polish campaign, were now being tested against a completely different kind of warfare. He adapted with a speed that his superiors noted and rewarded, but adaptation came at a cost that accumulated quietly in the form of men who did not return and vehicles that never ran again. By late summer and into autumn of 1941, the pace of the advance had slowed considerably. The Wehrmacht had scored extraordinary strategic victories, encircling enormous Soviet forces at Kiev and elsewhere. But the losses in men and equipment were already significant, and the replacements were not arriving fast enough to sustain the momentum. Peiper's regiment fought through this period with the grim efficiency that had become its signature, but the human arithmetic was becoming harder to ignore. Men he had trained and led, soldiers he knew by name and habit, were dying at a rate that could not be casually dismissed. The Eastern Front had a quality unlike any other theatre. It demanded everything and returned almost nothing except harder knowledge. When autumn broke into winter, the Eastern Front delivered its most devastating rebuke to German assumptions. The temperature dropped with a severity that defied the previous experience of most soldiers from Western and Central Europe. Equipment failed, Engines refused to turn over in air so cold that it seemed to have a physical weight. The supply system, already strained, essentially collapsed under the logistical demands of winter warfare for which the Wehrmacht had not adequately prepared. Men fought in uniforms designed for a short summer campaign, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes and lives with a patience that enemy fire sometimes could not match. Peiper fought through these conditions, keeping his men moving when movement itself seemed impossible. But the experience left marks that no amount of military decoration could fully conceal. Throughout this period, Peiper was developing something beyond mere tactical competence. He was acquiring a comprehensive and unsentimental understanding of attrition warfare, the kind of fighting that stripped away abstraction and theory and left only the raw mathematics of survival. He learned to assess situations in motion, to make decisions with incomplete information, and to commit to a course of action when hesitation meant destruction. These were precisely the qualities that mechanized commanders needed on the Eastern Front, where the tempo of operations left no space for careful deliberation. His superiors recognized in him a man who could think and act simultaneously, and they advanced him accordingly. But the war he was being advanced within was changing in ways that promotions could not address. The Soviet winter counteroffensive that began in December of 1941 struck German formations that were already exhausted and under strength. For the first time, German soldiers experienced what their Soviet counterparts had endured through the brutal opening months: the particular horror of retreat, of abandoned positions and surrendered ground. For units like Peiper's, which had been defined by their aggressive forward momentum, the psychological adjustment to defensive and rearguard operations was profound. Holding a line against pressure that seemed inexhaustible required a different kind of courage than leading an armored column into open terrain, and the men who had arrived in the Soviet Union full of confidence were now discovering what sustained industrial warfare actually looked like from the wrong end of it. Peiper's personal authority over his men became increasingly important during these periods of defensive stress. A commander who could hold the confidence of exhausted, frightened soldiers and keep them functioning as a coherent unit was worth far more in these conditions than tactical brilliance alone. Those who served under him described a man whose presence on the line had a stabilizing effect, not through false reassurance, but through the plain communication that retreat was controlled, that the situation was understood, that someone with authority was making decisions. This quality, the ability to project calm competence under catastrophic pressure, was one that would follow Peiper through the remaining years of the war, defining both his effectiveness and the loyalty he inspired in the men who served him. The spring and summer of 1942 brought renewed German offensive momentum in the south, as operations drove toward the Caucasus and the Volga. Peiper moved with these operations, his unit cycling between the brutal intensity of combat and the brief, inadequate intervals of rest that preceded the next engagement. The Eastern Front by this point had become its own world, governed by its own logic, with its own geography of villages burned to foundations and roads marked by the detritus of two armies grinding against each other. New soldiers arrived from Germany to replace the dead and wounded, and Peiper watched them arrive with the particular awareness of a man who understood exactly what was coming for them. The Eastern Front did not waste time on sentiment. What the Russian campaign gave Peiper, in addition to battlefield experience, was a deep familiarity with the texture of total war, the kind of conflict that had no clear edge between military necessity and human catastrophe. The Eastern Front was not a theater in the conventional sense. It was a consuming environment that swallowed men and machines and returned them in altered states. Peiper emerged from his first full year in the Soviet Union as a genuinely formidable combat commander, capable of functioning at a high level under conditions that destroyed lesser officers. He had earned his reputation through performance that was consistently observed and documented by those above him, and his advancement reflected a genuine assessment of his military value. But the Eastern Front extracted its accounting in ways that did not appear on promotion orders or decoration citations. Every soldier who endured it long enough carried something east of the Dnieper that could not be left behind, some compression of experience that altered the internal calibration by which they measured the world. Peiper was no exception to this. The man who had crossed into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 with the confidence of an ascending young officer was not the same man who fought through the winter campaigns and absorbed the first clear signals that German victory in the East was not the certainty it had appeared. He had learned what war cost at scale, and he had learned it in the most unsparing classroom that the 20th century produced. The battles ahead, at Kharkov, at Kursk, and eventually in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, would draw on everything the Russian crucible had forged in him, for better and for worse. The winter of 1942 arrived on the Eastern Front with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate. Temperatures plunged so far below freezing that engine oil solidified in the night, that frostbitten fingers could no longer distinguish steel from skin, that the ground became too hard for the dead to be buried in any conventional sense. For Joachim Peiper, now a seasoned officer with the stains of Poland and the opening months of Barbarossa already worked into his experience, this cold was not a shock so much as a confirmation. The Eastern Front did not merely test men, it sorted them. It separated those who could function under conditions of extreme privation from those who could not, and it did so with a brutal, unapologetic efficiency that no training exercise could ever approximate. Peiper had survived the first catastrophic winter, the one that had frozen the Wehrmacht's ambitions outside Moscow and stripped away the army's confidence in a quick victory. He had watched the strategy of annihilation falter against Soviet depth and Soviet stubbornness, and he had drawn his conclusions quietly, as capable officers tend to do. Now, heading into another year of industrial-scale warfare, he was sharpening himself against the stone of accumulated experience. The city of Kharkov would become, over the course of several brutal months, one of the most contested pieces of ground on the entire Eastern Front. It changed hands multiple times, taken, lost, retaken, lost again, in a cycle of destruction that reduced its pre-war population and its pre-war architecture to something barely recognizable. For the soldiers fighting through its streets and its outlying districts, it offered a particular kind of combat that tank commanders despised and infantry commanders dreaded equally: close quarters, urban, unpredictable, where the advantages of German mechanized doctrine were constantly neutralized by rubble and proximity. Peiper understood intuitively what the manuals struggled to codify: that urban fighting demanded flexibility at the lowest level of command, that the officer who waited for orders from above while a tactical opportunity opened and closed in front of him had already failed. His reputation within his regiment rested partly on this understanding, on the visible readiness to make a decision and act on it before the moment dissolved. German armour in this period was undergoing its own evolution, and Peiper moved within that evolution as both student and practitioner. The Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German armoured force, was receiving upgraded guns and additional armour plating in direct response to the shock of encountering Soviet T-34 tanks the previous year. New vehicles were entering service, and with them came new tactics, new doctrines, new expectations of what an armored spearhead could accomplish under the right conditions. Peiper absorbed these developments with the appetite of a man who recognized that technical mastery was not separate from battlefield courage, but was instead its necessary complement. A brave officer in a tactically inferior position simply died more impressively. An officer who combined courage with technical understanding and situational awareness, that officer could achieve outcomes that appeared, to outside observers, almost inexplicable. The fighting around Kharkov in the early months of 1943 provided Peiper with exactly the kind of conditions that separated commanders from subordinates. The German position was, by any honest assessment, precarious. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had concluded in February of that year, swallowing an entire German army and shattering the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility in a way that could not be papered over with propaganda. Soviet forces had pushed westward in the aftermath, sensing weakness, sensing opportunity, and the German line in the south had buckled alarmingly. It was in this context that the Waffen-SS formations, Peiper's among them, were thrown into counter-offensive operations designed to stabilize a front that seemed on the verge of complete rupture. The intensity of what followed was concentrated into a relatively brief window of time, but the concentration of violence within that window was extraordinary. What Peiper demonstrated during the Kharkov fighting was an understanding of tempo, of how the pace of an operation, managed correctly, could prevent an enemy from consolidating, from resupplying, from bringing his reserves forward in any coherent fashion. He drove his subordinates hard, not out of recklessness, but out of a calculated conviction that momentum, once surrendered, was nearly impossible to recover without paying a second and far higher price to reclaim it. His men operated at the edge of endurance, taking objectives before Soviet commanders had fully registered that the objectives were under threat. This approach had costs, in vehicles broken down from overuse, in soldiers pushed beyond sustainable fatigue, in supply lines stretched to the point of fragility. But in the brutal mathematics of this particular campaign, the costs were judged acceptable. Kharkov was retaken by German forces in mid-March of that year, a genuine tactical success carved out of what had seemed like impending catastrophe, and Peiper's unit had been part of its bloody recapture. His performance during those weeks did not go unnoticed. In the hierarchical world of the Waffen-SS, recognition came in specific forms, the language of awards and citations, of decorations that carried both honor and currency within the institution. The Iron Cross with oak leaves was not awarded casually. It required documented evidence of sustained exceptional performance, of multiple actions in which an officer had demonstrated the qualities that the SS placed at the center of its martial identity: courage, initiative, leadership under fire, and results. Peiper received his oak leaves during this period, and the citation that accompanied the award reflected, in the compressed formal language of military honors, what those who had served alongside him would have described in considerably more vivid terms. He had led from the front. He had made decisions that lesser officers would have deferred upward, and those decisions had been vindicated by outcomes. The decoration marked him, within the SS, as an officer of real consequence. Promotion followed acknowledgement. Peiper was elevated to the rank of major, Sturmbannführer in the language of the SS, and given command of his own panzer battalion. This was a meaningful step, not merely in terms of rank, but in terms of responsibility and resource. A battalion commander controlled a formation large enough to conduct independent operations, to shape local engagements rather than simply respond to them, and was held accountable for outcomes in a way that company-level command had not demanded. Peiper was now responsible not only for his own actions, but for the collective performance of hundreds of men and dozens of vehicles, for the logistical coherence of an armored unit in the field, for the morale of soldiers who looked upward for evidence that their suffering was being converted into something purposeful. He accepted this responsibility with the visible certainty of a man who had been moving toward exactly this position for several years. The summer of 1943 brought the massive armored confrontation at Kursk, a battle on a scale that defied easy description. The German High Command had planned a major offensive operation against a large Soviet salient, a bulge in the front line, intending to cut off and destroy the Soviet forces within it. The Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, had prepared their defenses with an attention to depth and density that the Germans had not fully anticipated. What followed was weeks of grinding, attritional combat in which the German armored advantage was systematically absorbed and eroded by minefields, anti-tank guns, prepared defensive positions, and Soviet armor in numbers that seemed to grow rather than diminish, regardless of losses inflicted. Peiper's battalion fought within this larger nightmare, its operational freedom constricted by the sheer density of the defenses and the scale of Soviet counterpressure. Kursk was, for those who fought it and survived, a different kind of education than Kharkov. At Kharkov, German aggression had found space to express itself and had achieved results. At Kursk, that same aggression ran into prepared opposition and was consumed without producing decisive outcomes. The offensive was ultimately called off, and German forces withdrew to their starting positions, having suffered severe armored losses they could not easily replace. For Peiper, watching the armored strength of his battalion reduced through combat and mechanical attrition, this was a lesson absorbed in real time, that the resource base that German operations depended upon was finite in a way that Soviet resource regeneration seemed not to be. The Soviets brought up replacements, in tanks, in men, in artillery, at a rate that suggested industrial and organizational reserves of a different order entirely. There was a quality in Peiper's approach to command during this period that his contemporaries remarked upon, a kind of controlled coldness that could be mistaken for detachment, but was in fact something more complex. He was not indifferent to the men under his command. The evidence of those who served with him suggests a commanding officer who knew his officers and non-commissioned officers by name, who understood the particular capabilities and limitations of individual crews and vehicle commanders. But he was capable of subordinating sentiment to operational requirement with a discipline that some found admirable and others found disturbing. In the Eastern Front's economy of survival, this capacity was a professional asset. Men followed him not because he was warm, but because they believed he would get them out, that his judgment in the worst moments was more reliable than their own fear. What the Eastern Front was doing to the broader German war effort by the close of 1943, however, could not be compensated for by the performance of any individual officer, however capable. The arithmetic of the war in the East had turned, definitively and irreversibly, against Germany. Production figures, replacement rates, territorial depth, strategic reserve, all of these variables now favored the Soviet Union in ways that would compound rather than diminish over the months ahead. Peiper understood this, or understood enough of it to recognize that the campaigns he was fighting were no longer aimed at victory in any meaningful strategic sense. They were aimed at delay, at preservation, at the management of a retreat that German command could not yet bring itself to name as such. The Iron Cross at his collar and the battalion at his command represented genuine achievement within a framework that was beginning to rot at its foundations. And yet the instinct of the professional soldier, the one that had been trained and tested and rewarded over nearly a decade of service, was to continue, to hold the line another day, to counterattack where counterattack remained possible, to extract something functional from conditions that offered increasingly little room for optimism. The promotions and decorations of this period were real, earned against genuine opposition at genuine cost. But they were also, in a way that Peiper may or may not have fully acknowledged to himself, awards given on a burning ship. The tide of war was moving eastward, taking German ambition with it, and no individual courage or tactical brilliance was sufficient to reverse the direction of that current. What lay ahead was not victory reshaped into a different form. What lay ahead was something far harder to face. There is a particular quality to retreat that no military academy prepares a soldier for. Advance has its own grammar, objectives, axes of movement, momentum carrying men forward past fear and exhaustion. But retreat is a different language entirely, one spoken in the vocabulary of abandoned equipment, shrinking perimeters, and the unspoken arithmetic of men who will not return. For Joachim Peiper, who had spent the better part of 3 years pressing eastward across the Soviet Union, with a confidence bordering on certainty, the reversal that began in earnest through 1943 and deepened through 1944 was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was a fundamental rewriting of everything he had been taught to believe about German arms, German will, and the direction of this war. The education was brutal, and it left marks that no decoration could conceal. The momentum that had carried German forces to the gates of Moscow and deep into the Caucasus had already begun to fracture before the year 1943 was half spent. Stalingrad had fallen in February of that year, swallowing an entire German army and returning nothing. The strategic map, which German officers had once traced with pride and a marker moving steadily east, now demanded a different kind of reading. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains in the desperate autumn of 1941, had rebuilt itself into something formidable and relentless. New tanks, new artillery, new armies, organized, supplied, and hungry for ground, were appearing along a front that stretched thousands of kilometers, and the men tasked with holding that front were neither as numerous nor as fresh as they had once been. Peiper, sharpened by his experiences at Kharkov and in the great mechanized clashes of that summer, understood mechanized warfare well enough to read what the numbers implied, even when his superiors chose not to. The rearguard action is one of the oldest and least glamorous duties in land warfare. It demands that a smaller force hold back a larger one for long enough that the main body can withdraw to a defensible position, buying distance with casualties and time with blood. Peiper fought these actions repeatedly across the Eastern Theatre as German lines contracted through the latter half of 1943. His regiment would hold a village or a river crossing, absorb pressure that the maps suggested should not have existed, and then fall back to do it again. The rhythm was punishing and demoralizing, not because individual engagements were lost, many were not, but because each successful defense led only to another withdrawal, another position surrendered, another marker on the map moved westward. Winning the skirmish while losing the campaign was a corrosive experience for a man of Peiper's temperament. Fuel and armored vehicles were the lifeblood of the SS Panzer formations, and both were now subjects of anxious accounting. The industrial logic that had once worked in Germany's favor, superior tank design, disciplined crews, coordinated doctrine, had not disappeared, but it was being overwhelmed by scale. Soviet factories were producing tanks and self-propelled guns at rates German planners had simply not anticipated or had chosen not to believe. When Peiper lost a tank, to a hit from Soviet armor, to an anti-tank gun dug into a tree line, to mechanical failure on roads that chewed through tracks and gearboxes, replacement was no longer certain or swift. The careful arithmetic of combat power available versus combat power required was increasingly unfavorable, and Peiper, a man who had built his reputation on precise understanding of what his forces could accomplish, could feel the balance shifting beneath him. Every vehicle that burned on the steppe represented not just a tactical loss, but a widening gap between what was demanded and what remained. Men, too, were irreplaceable in a way that became increasingly stark. The soldiers who had fought alongside Peiper through the opening phases of Barbarossa and beyond were veterans of a particular kind, men formed by shared experience into something cohesive and capable. As that cohort was ground down through attrition, the replacements who arrived were younger, less experienced, and sometimes drawn from the margins of the manpower pool that the Reich was now scraping with increasing desperation. Peiper worked them hard, as he had always worked those under his command, but no amount of discipline or training could fully substitute for the institutional knowledge that lived in experienced soldiers who had already made their mistakes and survived them. The regiment he led in the closing months of the Eastern Front campaigns was a different instrument than the one he had wielded at Kharkov, and the difference was not in his command style, but in the raw material he had been given to work with. The psychological dimension of this period is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but it cannot be set aside. Peiper had entered the war as a believer in German military supremacy, in the ideological framework that gave his service its meaning, in the proposition that will and aggression could overcome material disadvantage. The Eastern Front in its opening phase had seemed to confirm these beliefs. Cities fell, armies surrendered, and the German advance moved with a speed that astonished even those conducting it. But the winter of 1941–42 had introduced the first doubts. The battles of 1942 and 43 had deepened them, and by 1944, as Soviet forces punched through German defensive lines with a coordinated competence that had simply not existed 3 years earlier, the ideological certainty that had once insulated men like Peiper from hard questions was no longer adequate insulation. What remained was professionalism, the commitment to doing the job, regardless of what the job now meant. There is testimony from those who served alongside Peiper during this period that describes a man who had not lost his aggressive edge, but had recalibrated it for different circumstances. He was still demanding, still present at the front rather than behind it, still capable of making rapid decisions under pressure. But the quality of his belief had changed. Where once his aggressiveness had been animated by genuine confidence in German victory, it now operated in a colder register, a professional determination to extract the maximum from a deteriorating situation, not because he believed the outcome could be reversed, but because that was what soldiers did, and that was what he did. This distinction between belief and professionalism matters. It shaped the decisions he would carry forward into the final year of the war. The geography of retreat is its own kind of wound. Soldiers who advance through territory mark it in memory as conquered. Roads traveled, villages passed, distances covered. Soldiers who then withdraw over the same ground experience something close to the inverse of this. Every familiar landmark becomes evidence of failure. Every kilometer covered in the wrong direction, a subtraction from something that once felt permanent. The Soviet terrain that Peiper's forces had moved across with such purpose in the summer of 1941 was now being surrendered, piece by piece, across 1943 and into 1944. The psychological weight of this reversal, felt across thousands of kilometers of front by hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, is almost impossible to quantify, but it was real, and it infected even the most disciplined formations with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. By the time the Great Soviet Summer Offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, tore through German Army Group Center and shattered formations that had held their positions for months, the writing was on the wall, in letters large enough to read from considerable distance. The offensive unfolded with a scale and operational sophistication that demonstrated how thoroughly the Red Army had studied the German methods and surpassed them in application. German losses in men and equipment were staggering, and the front that had been painstakingly defended through months of rearguard action collapsed in sectors that weeks earlier had seemed manageable. For Peiper, the confirmation that the Eastern Front could not be stabilized was not news. He had felt its truth building for more than a year, but the scale and speed of Soviet success in that summer gave it a finality that moved it from fear to fact. The transfer of experienced panzer formations to other theaters was not unique to Peiper's unit, but it represented a recognition by German High Command that the Eastern Front was consuming resources faster than they could be generated. SS Panzer formations, among the most capable and most heavily equipped in the German order of battle, were needed elsewhere, particularly as the Allied landings in Normandy in June of 1944 opened a Western Front that demanded armoured response. Peiper's reassignment westward came in this context, not as a reward or a fresh opportunity, but as a redeployment of a scarce asset from one crisis to another. He left the Eastern Front carrying everything he had learned there: the tactical competence, the physical endurance, the professional coldness, and carrying also the understanding that the war he had believed in was not the war he was now fighting. What follows a man into his next command matters. The Eastern Front had made Peiper into something more complicated than the ambitious young officer who had crossed into the Soviet Union in 1941. The experience of sustained defeat, of fighting hard for ground that was surrendered anyway, of watching experienced soldiers die and be replaced by less experienced ones who then also died. This leaves residue in a commander's decision-making, even when the commander cannot articulate precisely what has changed. The aggression that would define his conduct in the Ardennes weeks later was not the aggression of a man who believed he could win. It was the aggression of a man who understood that half measures in a losing position only guaranteed a slower loss. That understanding, forged through the grinding reversals of the Eastern Front, would drive everything that came next, and it would carry consequences he could not yet foresee, moving through the winter forest of Belgium toward a village called Malmedy. The year was 1944, and the arc of Joachim Peiper's war had begun to bend in an unfamiliar direction. For 3 years, he had known only the vast, brutal expanses of the Eastern Front, the endless steppe, the grinding tank battles, the slow and terrible retreat that punctured the myth of German invincibility. But in the summer of that 4th year, as the Western Allies consolidated their foothold in Normandy and Soviet armies pushed closer to the Reich's borders, German High Command made a strategic calculation that would pluck Peiper from the Russian theatre and transplant him to a new arena of conflict. It was not a reward, though it may have seemed so on its surface. It was, in fact, a calculated decision to place one of the Wehrmacht's most aggressive panzer commanders where the leadership believed a dramatic reversal of fortune might still be possible. The Western Front was to become his final testing ground. The reassignment came in the spring of 1944, when Peiper transferred from his battalion command in the decimated ranks of the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front to the 1st SS Panzer Corps under Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich himself was a figure of towering importance in the Nazi hierarchy, a man of limited formal education but commanding presence, an old Nazi Party stalwart with Hitler's ear and the resources to build military muscle in the West. The 1st SS Panzer Corps was not yet a fully formed organization. It was in the process of reconstitution and reinforcement, drawing the freshest tanks, the newest equipment, and the most promising officers from across the fractured Wehrmacht structure. Peiper's arrival marked a significant moment in its development. Here was a combat veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had survived the terrible attrition of the Russian campaigns, who knew panzer tactics at the operational level, and who carried the reputation of a commander who could drive his men and his machines beyond what others thought possible. To Dietrich and his staff, Peiper represented the bridge between the army's storied past and its uncertain future. Once settled in his new assignment, Peiper quickly assumed command of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, a unit that embodied the cutting edge of German mechanized warfare in the West. The regiment was built around the newest and most formidable tanks in the German arsenal, the Panther and the Tiger, vehicles that possessed superior firepower and thicker armor than much of what the Western Allies could field. But tanks alone do not constitute an army. Peiper inherited as well a supporting structure of half-tracks, reconnaissance vehicles, anti-tank elements, and supporting infantry that gave the regiment genuine operational flexibility. His soldiers were a mixture of hardened veterans like himself and younger men who had been scraped together from various replacement depots and training establishments. Some had Eastern Front experience, others were fresh conscripts or Hitler Youth graduates who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The challenge of forging this heterogeneous collection into a cohesive fighting force fell squarely on Peiper's shoulders, and he approached the task with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized his command style in the East. Belgium in the summer and autumn of 1944 presented a profound contrast to the frozen steppes and scorched earth of Russia. The landscape was temperate, populated, and still bore the scars of conquest, but not the wholesale devastation that had transformed Soviet territory into a wasteland. Peiper's regiment was stationed in preparation for operations, though the nature and timing of those operations remained shrouded in the peculiar fog that always surrounded German strategic planning in this phase of the war. The soldiers underwent intensive training exercises, conducting mobile warfare drills across the rolling Belgian countryside, practicing breakthrough tactics and rapid exploitation of penetrations. Peiper drove these exercises with characteristic intensity, pushing his men and machines hard, seeking to identify weaknesses and correct them before they could prove fatal in actual combat. Officers and enlisted men alike learned to recognize his distinctive silhouette, tall, sharp-featured, with cold eyes that seemed to assess everything around him with the calculation of a chess master. His presence on the training field was electric. Men responded to him with a mixture of respect and fear that was the hallmark of an exceptional commander. The broader context of this period cannot be overlooked. By the summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting a war it could no longer win, though this reality had not yet fully penetrated the consciousness of Hitler and his immediate circle. The Normandy landings had succeeded despite German defences, and the Allies were slowly grinding their way inland, absorbing casualties but advancing nonetheless. In the east, the Soviet offensives of 1944 were driving deep into German-held territory, threatening to breach the Reich's borders before the year was out. German production was struggling to keep pace with losses, and fuel shortages were beginning to constrain operational planning in ways that had never been necessary before. Yet German high command still clung to the hope that a dramatic military operation could shift the balance, could split the Allied coalition, could buy time for new wonder weapons or diplomatic breakthroughs. This desperate optimism infected the upper echelons of command, and it began to circulate through the officer corps that something significant was being planned, something that would restore momentum to the German war effort. Peiper himself existed in the peculiar position of a senior officer who sensed the approaching collapse yet remained committed to the prosecution of his duties. His Eastern Front experience had taught him the bitter taste of defeat, the exhaustion that came from fighting a retreating war against an enemy with superior resources and inexhaustible manpower. Yet he was also a professional soldier with a hierarchical understanding of his obligations. When orders came from above, they were to be executed with precision and aggression, regardless of the officer's personal doubts about the ultimate outcome. In this regard, Peiper was not unique. Thousands of Wehrmacht officers operated within this same psychological framework, obeying, executing, compartmentalizing their awareness of strategic reality in order to focus on the immediate tactical problem before them. It was, perhaps, a convenient arrangement, one that allowed men to wage war without confronting certain uncomfortable truths about the cause for which they fought and the methods employed in its service. As autumn approached in 1944, rumors began to crystallize into something more concrete. Senior commanders were summoned to briefings where operations were outlined in carefully controlled settings. The broad concept was remarkable in its ambition. A massive offensive through the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, designed to punch through what was judged to be a weakly held section of the American lines, drive rapidly westward toward Antwerp, and accomplish the encirclement and destruction of major Allied formations. The operation represented Germany's last serious attempt at offensive action on the Western Front, a final roll of the dice in the hope of altering the war's trajectory. Hitler himself championed the plan with the fervor of a man convinced that bold action remained the answer to Germany's accumulating problems. The operation would be called Autumn Mist, a name that carried the weight of desperation, dressed in the language of strategic aspiration. Peiper and his 1st SS Panzer Regiment would be assigned a critical role in this offensive, the spearhead of the breakthrough, the force tasked with achieving rapid penetration and exploitation deep into the American rear. The assignment was both an honor and an extraordinary burden. To be given the most aggressive and mechanized unit in the SS, to be positioned as the tip of Germany's last offensive spear, was a recognition of Peiper's abilities and his willingness to push his men beyond normal limits in pursuit of military objectives. Yet it was also a guarantee of the highest stakes imaginable. Success in the Ardennes offensive could theoretically alter the course of the war. Failure would mean heavy casualties among the regiment and a further contraction of German strategic space. Peiper accepted the assignment without hesitation, though the private thoughts of a man of his intelligence about the true viability of the operation remain a matter of historical speculation. What is known is that he threw himself into the detailed planning and preparation with the same energy he had devoted to every other military challenge. Maps were studied, routes were memorized, coordination procedures were rehearsed with subordinate commanders, and the regiment was brought to the highest possible state of readiness. The autumn of 1944 carried a particular atmospheric quality for the men of Peiper's regiment. Behind them lay months of preparation and training. Ahead lay the promise of action that would determine their immediate futures. There was an undercurrent of anticipation mixed with apprehension, the psychological state that precedes any major military operation. Some soldiers believed in the mission, genuinely convinced that a dramatic German offensive could still achieve victory, or at least a favorable negotiated peace. Others harbored doubts, but suppressed them beneath layers of military discipline and the simple fact that soldiers do not command their strategic assignments. Still others existed in a grey zone of ambiguity, performing their duties competently while maintaining internal skepticism about the enterprise as a whole. Peiper's role was to ensure that regardless of individual soldiers' beliefs about the mission, they executed their assigned tasks with precision and aggression. In this, he was a professional, and professionalism was the language he spoke most fluently. The physical and material preparations consumed the final weeks of 1944. Tanks were maintained to the highest possible standard, weapons were cleaned and test-fired, ammunition was distributed and inventoried, rations were accumulated, maps were updated, and communication procedures were tested in exercises that simulated actual combat conditions. The regiment's officers studied the terrain over which they would be expected to advance, memorizing the locations of villages, the routes of roads, and the positions of known or suspected American defensive positions. Peiper personally supervised many of these preparations, his presence serving as both inspiration and enforcer of standards. Veterans of the Eastern Front recognized the distinctive quality of his leadership, the relentless demand for excellence, the intolerance of complacency, the manner in which he seemed to absorb information through sheer force of will and then transmit it back to his subordinates in the form of concrete orders and expectations. By December 1944, the moment of execution was finally at hand. Peiper's regiment, integrated into the larger structure of the 1st SS Panzer Corps and positioned as the spearhead of the breakthrough force, stood ready to implement the Ardennes Offensive. The men were as prepared as any body of soldiers could be for an operation whose ultimate success or failure would depend on variables beyond their control. The weather, the American response, the availability of fuel, the cooperation of adjacent German formations, and countless other factors that could influence the outcome. What could be controlled? The training of the men, the maintenance of the equipment, the clarity of orders, and the strength of leadership had been attended to as thoroughly as German military capability and resources allowed. Peiper himself embodied a kind of compressed intensity in those final days before the operation. He was a soldier positioned on the precipice of his most significant operational assignment, leading forces that had been gathered specifically for an offensive designed to reverse the broader trajectory of the war. Whether he believed in the ultimate success of the mission, whether he harbored private doubts about the Reich's long-term viability, remained locked within the private chambers of his mind. What remained visible to the world was the image of a confident, capable panzer commander preparing to lead his regiment into battle once more, bringing with him all the experience, aggression, and ruthlessness that the Eastern Front had taught him to employ. By late 1944, the strategic situation facing Nazi Germany had deteriorated beyond recovery. The Soviet Red Army pressed westward from the east, having reclaimed Ukraine and Poland, and now threatening the German heartland itself. On the Western Front, American and British forces had broken out from Normandy, liberated Paris in late August, and were steadily pushing toward the Rhine. Germany's armies were compressed into an ever-shrinking territory, fighting on two fronts with dwindling manpower and fuel reserves that grew scarcer by the week. Yet in this twilight hour, Hitler and his remaining generals conceived one final, audacious gamble, a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest that they believed could still change the course of the war. It was a plan born of desperation, sustained by fading hope, and assigned to men like Joachim Peiper, who embodied the last aggressive spirit of the Wehrmacht. The plan itself, codenamed Operation Autumn Mist by the Germans, had emerged from Hitler's fevered imagination during the late summer of 1944. The Führer had become increasingly detached from reality, spending his days in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, issuing orders that ignored the actual capabilities of his forces. Yet this time, his generals brought him a proposal that seemed to offer a glimmer of possibility. The Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, they argued, represented a weak point in the Allied line. The American forces holding the area were thinly spread, often inexperienced units rotating through what was considered a quiet sector. If a powerful panzer army could punch through this lightly defended zone, cross the Meuse River, and race toward the Belgian port city of Antwerp, they could split the American and British armies in two. The very audacity of such an offensive, they reasoned, might force the Allies to negotiate or at least buy Germany enough time to stabilize its position and pursue a negotiated peace. The operational concept was both simple and ambitious in its scale. 3 German armies would attack across a broad front stretching roughly 180 kilometers from north to south. The 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich would strike in the north toward Liège, while the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel would thrust through the center toward the Meuse crossings. The 7th Army would protect the southern flank of the offensive against American forces based around Luxembourg. German planners had assembled approximately 200,000 soldiers, roughly 1,500 tanks and assault guns, and extensive artillery and air support for the assault. This was a tremendous concentration of force, scraped together from reserves across German-occupied Europe and from units pulled back from the Eastern Front. Yet it represented less than a fraction of the strength Germany had possessed during the invasions of Poland or France 4 and 5 years earlier. The Wehrmacht was committing nearly all its remaining reserves to this single desperate throw of the dice. Within this grand design, Joachim Peiper and his 1st SS Panzer Regiment occupied a position of particular strategic importance and privilege. Peiper's unit, part of the 1st SS Panzer Corps under Sepp Dietrich, was selected to form the cutting edge of the offensive's northern thrust. He commanded roughly 2,000 soldiers organized into Panzer and Panzer Grenadier companies, supported by roughly 40 to 50 tanks, primarily Panther tanks with their high-velocity 75mm guns and a few fearsome Tiger tanks mounting 88mm cannons. His regiment had been transferred to Belgium in the late autumn of 1944 and had been training and preparing for weeks before the offensive. Peiper's reputation for aggression, tactical flexibility, and ruthless determination made him the obvious choice to lead the most ambitious breakthrough operation. He was a man in his late 20s, already bearing the Iron Cross with oak leaves on his chest, and he had earned the respect of the most senior SS commanders as a leader who could drive his men forward under conditions of extreme difficulty and maintain offensive momentum even when circumstances seemed to dictate caution. The planning process for Peiper's specific role took place during November and early December 1944, often in tense meetings at divisional and corps headquarters, where optimism clashed with technical reality. Peiper's task was unambiguous. His panzer regiment would follow immediately behind the initial German infantry assault that would break through the American defensive lines near Lochheim. Once the infantry had created a gap in the enemy position, Peiper's armored columns would exploit the breakthrough, racing westward at maximum speed to cover as much ground as possible before American reserves could be committed. He was to bypass any significant points of resistance rather than become bogged down in protracted fighting, avoiding towns and strongpoints that might slow his advance. The ultimate objective was to reach the Meuse River within 2 or 3 days, cross at Huy or nearby crossings, and then continue driving toward Antwerp another 100 kilometers beyond. The entire operation, from initial assault to the seizure of Antwerp, was to be completed before American reinforcements could arrive and establish a cohesive defense. The specific roads and routes for Peiper's advance had been studied in meticulous detail by German staff officers, who had prepared detailed maps and reconnaissance reports. His column would move along specific secondary roads through the Ardennes, avoiding main routes that might be congested with other German traffic or exposed to enemy air attack. The Germans understood that the key to success lay in speed and surprise. If Peiper could maintain momentum, push through lightly defended areas, and race deep into the American rear before opposition could coalesce, the entire American position might collapse. German Air Force fighters and fighter bombers would operate overhead to provide protection against Allied aircraft, though many officers harbored serious doubts about whether the Luftwaffe could maintain air superiority over Belgium, given the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Allies. Nevertheless, on paper, the plan possessed a certain mathematical elegance: concentrated force at a vulnerable point, rapid exploitation of success, and the potential for operational deep strike that could undermine the entire American position on the continent. What the plan fundamentally lacked, however, was any serious mechanism for sustaining such an ambitious offensive over extended distances. Fuel supplies were already desperately short throughout the Wehrmacht, and the German logistical system was simply inadequate to support rapid mobile operations across multiple fronts. Peiper's Panzer Regiment would require hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel to cover the distances assigned to it, and German supply lines were already stretched to the breaking point. There were also insufficient bridging materials to guarantee that German engineers could rapidly construct crossings over the Meuse if the planned crossing sites were destroyed or defended. Air superiority was at best uncertain, and American reinforcements could be moved into the threatened area far more quickly than German planners seemed to acknowledge in their optimistic planning documents. Yet these doubts, when raised by subordinate commanders, were dismissed as defeatist thinking. Hitler had spoken, and the operation would proceed with the assumption that willpower, aggressive action, and the remaining strength of the German soldier would overcome mere material obstacles. Peiper himself participated in final briefings conducted during the first week of December at Corps and Divisional headquarters, where the operation was gradually revealed to the commanders who would execute it. The secrecy surrounding the offensive had been maintained with remarkable discipline. Most of the ordinary soldiers in Peiper's regiment did not know they were preparing for a major attack, believing instead they were simply training for potential defensive operations. Peiper, however, understood the magnitude and the audacity of what was being asked of him. He studied maps, absorbed the operational concept, and began organizing his regiment for what would be the most ambitious and rapid mobile operation of his entire military career. He was told that the offensive represented Germany's final opportunity to reverse the tide of the war, to achieve a breakthrough that would force the Allies to reconsider their insistence on unconditional surrender, and to buy Germany time to develop new weapons or negotiate a favorable peace. Whether Peiper truly believed that such an outcome was possible remains unclear, but he prepared himself and his men for the assault with characteristic thoroughness and determination. The physical preparation during those final weeks of November and early December 1944 had been intense and thorough. Peiper's tanks had been serviced and checked repeatedly to ensure they were in peak mechanical condition. Ammunition had been stockpiled along routes where it could be quickly loaded into vehicles when the order came. The soldiers had been driven through rehearsals and simulations of rapid movement through difficult terrain. The column had practiced maintaining high speeds while navigating narrow roads and coordinating with supporting units. New recruits who had recently joined the regiment had been integrated into the veteran units, though many of these newer soldiers lacked the experience and discipline of the men who had fought for years on the Eastern Front. Peiper knew that maintaining cohesion and momentum during an operation would be challenging, particularly if his column encountered determined resistance or suffered significant casualties. Yet he believed that aggressive leadership, clear orders, and the professionalism of his officer corps could overcome these obstacles. The intelligence picture available to German planners painted a picture of American weakness that was substantially accurate in its broad outlines, if not in its details. The American forces holding the Ardennes sector were in fact thinly spread, with divisions spread across a wide frontage. Many of the units were newly arrived or were there to rest and refit after previous operations. American positions were based on the assumption that no major German attack was imminent and that the Ardennes represented a relatively quiet sector where units could recover and consolidate. What German intelligence had failed to appreciate, however, was the speed and efficiency with which American reserves could be committed once the threat was recognized. American armor, artillery, and mechanized infantry could move across European roads with far greater speed than their German counterparts due to superior logistics, fuel supplies, and the quality of American vehicles. The American capacity for rapid concentration of force, which had proved devastating at other points during the previous months, was still dramatically underestimated by German planners. The weather forecast for the middle of December 1944 had been a matter of considerable discussion and concern among the planners. Overcast skies and the possibility of snow were predicted, which was actually advantageous to the Germans, as it would reduce the effectiveness of Allied air power. The roads in the Ardennes during winter could become muddy and difficult to navigate, potentially slowing down all traffic, German and American alike. Yet in some respects, the coming of winter added urgency to the operation. The longer it was delayed, the more difficult weather and visibility would become, potentially negating the advantages that the Germans hoped to achieve through surprise and speed. The decision was made to launch the offensive in mid-December, with the actual date being established as December 16th. This would give German forces 2 or 3 weeks before the weather would deteriorate further and before Christmas, when there might be some expectation of reduced military activity on both sides. As the days of December 1944 ticked away, final preparations accelerated. Peiper's regiment received its detailed operational orders, specifying precisely which roads it would follow, which formations it would operate with, and what its immediate and ultimate objectives would be. The soldiers under his command began moving into assembly areas in the Ardennes, attempting to conceal their preparations from American reconnaissance, despite the difficulty of hiding thousands of vehicles, troops, and artillery pieces. The weather began to deteriorate, with snow falling and temperatures dropping well below freezing. Peiper spent his final hours before the offensive in quiet preparation, reviewing maps, checking on his units, and mentally preparing himself for what he believed would be the most significant test of his military career. He knew that the Wehrmacht's survival as an effective fighting force depended on the success of this operation, though he probably harbored few illusions about whether it could actually achieve the grandiose objectives that Hitler had set. What he did believe was that he could drive his regiment forward with greater speed and determination than anyone expected, that he could achieve breakthrough and deep penetration into the American rear, and that he could prove once again that the SS Panzer Corps represented the cutting edge of German combat power. On the eve of December 16, 1944, Joachim Peiper stood on the threshold of the final and most famous campaign of his military life. Chapter 9, Breakthrough, the First Hours. The winter darkness of the Ardennes held no mercy. At 0530 hours on the morning of the 16th of December 1944, the silence that had blanketed the Belgian forest shattered in a moment of calculated fury. Along a front stretching nearly 180 kilometers, German artillery pieces, thousands of them, opened fire simultaneously. The barrage began not with single shots, but with a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself, wave upon wave of high explosive and phosphorus rounds tearing upward into the pre-dawn sky. American soldiers in their forward positions, many of them inexperienced and unprepared, huddled in shallow foxholes and bunkers that offered little protection against the sheer weight of metal and fire descending upon them. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes, creating a zone of confusion and terror that would last far longer. This was the moment Germany had gambled everything on, the beginning of Operation Autumn Mist, the Ardennes Offensive that Hitler believed could still reverse the course of the war. For Joachim Peiper, waiting in his command half-track several kilometers behind the main gun line, this was the signal he had anticipated, the moment to launch his mechanized spearhead and drive westward into the American rear with every ounce of speed and violence his regiment could muster. By 0700 hours, as the artillery fire began to slacken, the 1st SS Panzer Regiment started its engines. Peiper sat in his command vehicle, his sharp features hardened by the cold and by a confidence born of years of combat on the Russian steppes. Around him, in columns stretching back for several kilometers through the forest roads of the Ardennes, tanks and half-tracks rumbled to life. The Panther tanks, with their sloped armor and powerful long-barreled guns, formed the spinal cord of his spearhead. Behind and around them came the lighter panzers, the armored half-tracks carrying panzer grenadiers, elite mechanized infantry, and supply vehicles laden with ammunition and fuel. The total force numbered roughly 2,000 men and nearly 150 tanks and assault guns, concentrated into a fist of armored power that represented some of the finest combat equipment and most aggressive soldiers the Wehrmacht could field. Peiper knew the route by heart. His orders were specific: break through the American line near Losheim, drive westward toward Malmedy and beyond, and continue racing toward the Meuse River and the distant prize of Antwerp. He had studied the maps until every village name, every road junction, and every forest path was committed to memory. His regiment was the tip of the entire 1st SS Panzer Corps' advance, and his success or failure would shape the opening hours of what Germany intended as its last desperate bid for victory. The German breakthrough came with startling speed. American positions near Losheim, held by elements of the 99th Infantry Division and scattered elements of the 106th Infantry Division, were thin and undermanned. Many American soldiers in these forward areas had arrived only days before and had not yet established deep defensive positions or prepared fallback routes. When the artillery fire lifted and Peiper's columns emerged from the forest, moving with practiced efficiency, the American defenders faced a moment of stark reality. They were being overrun by a mechanized force far superior in armor and mobility. Some American units fought stubbornly, buying time with their lives, but the sheer momentum of Peiper's advance carried through their positions like a breaking wave. German panzer grenadiers, trained and experienced, bypassed pockets of resistance and pressed forward, leaving mop-up operations to follow on forces. Peiper drove forward in his half-track, staying near the front of the column to observe the terrain and direct the advance personally. This was his preferred command style, not distant supervision, but leadership by presence, where he could see the obstacles immediately and respond with tactical flexibility. His subordinates, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front like himself, understood his methods and required little more than a pointing hand or a shouted order to redirect columns or exploit a gap in the American line. By mid-morning on the 16th, Peiper's regiment had advanced nearly 30 kilometers westward. The initial penetration had been deeper and faster than the most optimistic German planners had anticipated. American command and control had broken down in the confusion of the bombardment and the speed of the German assault. Nobody at higher levels seemed to have a clear picture of where Peiper's column was or what it had already accomplished. Telephone lines had been cut by artillery fire, radio reports were confused and contradictory. The psychological shock of the German offensive rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water. Soldiers who had expected a quiet winter in the Ardennes suddenly found themselves in headlong retreat, abandoning positions, fuel caches, and supplies in the darkness and snow. Peiper pressed on, aware that speed was everything. The longer his column could maintain momentum, the deeper he could cut into American territory before organized resistance could form. He had been told that he would have perhaps 24 hours, possibly 48 at the outside, before American reinforcements could reach the breakthrough sector. Every kilometer he covered during that window mattered. Every hour of advance could mean the difference between victory and failure. The world of the Ardennes in winter presented its own challenges, distinct from the open steppes of Russia where Peiper had learned his trade. The roads were narrow, often unpaved or poorly maintained, and twisted through dense forest and small villages. The advance column could move only as fast as the narrowest bottleneck in its route, and there were many such bottlenecks. Traffic jams formed whenever columns from different units converged on the same road, and Peiper's impatience with delays was legendary among his subordinates. He would personally drive forward to identify the cause of any holdup, and his reaction to poor coordination or inept leadership was immediate and harsh. Yet for all the challenges, the column maintained an average speed of roughly 12 kilometers per hour throughout the morning and early afternoon, remarkable for a mechanized formation moving through a region with only marginal road infrastructure. American stragglers and isolated soldiers were swept up and either captured or scattered into the surrounding woods. Supply depots and isolated command posts were overrun before their occupants could destroy documents or equipment. Peiper's men captured vehicles, ammunition, and intelligence documents that would have been valuable under any circumstances. The momentum built on itself, creating an almost dreamlike sense that the breakthrough might actually succeed, that German strategic ambitions were finally becoming reality after years of retreat and defeat. As afternoon deepened into early evening on the 16th, Peiper's column had advanced nearly 50 kilometers from its starting positions. His forward elements were approaching the towns of Honsfeld and Bullingen, where American support and service units, truck drivers, mechanics, medics, and supply clerks rather than combat infantry, suddenly found themselves in the path of the German spearhead. These men had little training for armored combat, and even less inclination to stand against overwhelming mechanized forces. Some fought briefly, most scattered, either in surrender or in flight. Peiper captured substantial quantities of American supplies at both locations, including fuel, a precious resource that he knew would be critical if his advance was to continue. The fuel question was already weighing on his mind. His assault had consumed vast quantities of gasoline, and the supply lines stretching back to German territory were under constant harassment from Allied aircraft and were far too long to guarantee timely replenishment. Every fuel truck he captured bought him another handful of kilometers toward Antwerp, yet he could never capture enough to fully solve the logistical problem. He knew this intellectually, but the commander in him always believed that one more breakthrough, one more rapid advance, would crack the American position wide open and make the supply problem irrelevant. By the evening of the 16th, Peiper's regiment had advanced approximately 65 kilometers and was operating well ahead of the main German offensive's planned progress. German High Command's scenario had anticipated slower gains in the opening day, expecting American resistance to stiffen more quickly. Instead, Peiper's rapid exploitation of the initial breakthrough had created conditions of near chaos in the American rear. Reports were contradictory and often simply wrong. Some American commanders were unsure whether they faced a major offensive or a reconnaissance raid. The sheer speed and depth of German penetration had disrupted the normal chain of command. Officers could not find their units. Units could not find their orders. In this disorder, Peiper's column appeared and disappeared like a predator moving through undergrowth. German intelligence confirmed that American armor reserves were beginning to move toward the breakthrough sector, but they would need many hours to reach the area. That night, as his regiment prepared makeshift positions and refueled captured American vehicles and fuel supplies, Peiper calculated his options. His original orders called for him to push through to the Meuse and beyond, but the scope of what was possible had begun to dawn on him. If he maintained his current pace, and if fuel and resistance remained manageable, he might actually achieve something unprecedented, a complete strategic breakthrough that could collapse the entire American defensive structure in the region. The morning of the 17th brought renewed momentum and a hardening realization of what Peiper had achieved in just one day of offensive operations. His regiment had moved farther and faster than almost any other component of the Ardennes offensive. The American defensive apparatus in his sector was broken and reeling. Prisoners were being herded into collections. Captured supplies were accumulating at each new position. Yet even as these successes mounted, small irritants began to gnaw at the clean perfection of the breakthrough. Fuel consumption was higher than projected. Roads were becoming choked with wreckage and slow-moving columns from other units. American reinforcements were arriving, not in large numbers yet, but with increasing frequency. Peiper knew that his window of opportunity was beginning to close imperceptibly. The question was not whether he could break through. He had already done that. The question was how far he could penetrate before the American military machine, shocked and disorganized though it was, could regroup and contain him. He would drive forward with characteristic aggression, exploiting every advantage, accepting calculated risks that would have seemed reckless under other circumstances. His regiment was now a deep spear point driven into American-held territory, and the next hours would determine whether that spear could advance far enough and fast enough to change the shape of the war itself. The first day had been dominated by breakthrough and exploitation. What came next would test not only his tactical abilities, but also his judgment, his nerve, and ultimately his humanity. The morning of the 17th of December broke cold and grey across the Belgian highlands. Peiper's column had already covered more ground than anyone expected in the first day of the offensive, smashing through the initial American defensive line with overwhelming force and speed. His tanks and half-tracks poured westward along narrow forest roads, the engines roaring in the thin, frozen air, drivers and gunners alert for the next pocket of American resistance. But somewhere in the chaos of rapid advance, amid the fog of war and the frantic movement of soldiers and vehicles, the machinery of combat would produce something that transcended the normal brutality of battle. What happened on that day, in and around the small village of Malmedy, would haunt Peiper's name for the rest of his life and become the defining measure by which his legacy would be judged. Around noon on that winter morning, elements of Peiper's spearhead column encountered a mixed group of American soldiers from Battery B of the 191st Artillery Observation Battalion. These men were not frontline combat troops, but support personnel, gunners, drivers, radio operators, scattered and disoriented by the speed and violence of the German breakthrough. Some American vehicles had been hit and abandoned. Others were lost or cut off from their parent units. The American soldiers, perhaps 200 in number, were moving without clear orders through the snow-covered landscape, trying to reach safety, aware only that German tanks had shattered their world in a matter of hours. When they encountered the German column near the crossroads close to Malmedy, they had little choice but to surrender or be killed where they stood. Most chose surrender, raising their hands and walking toward the German vehicles with the exhausted relief of men who believed their ordeal had ended and that they would, at least, survive. What followed in the next few minutes remains one of the most thoroughly investigated and documented episodes of the entire war. The exact sequence of events has been contested for decades, but the essential truth is beyond dispute. American prisoners were systematically executed by German soldiers. Contemporary accounts and post-war investigations established that approximately 80 men were killed, some shot in place, others marched into a nearby field and gunned down in groups. The prisoners had no weapons, offered no resistance, and posed no military threat. They were men who had surrendered in good faith, expecting the protections of the Geneva Convention. Instead, they were murdered. The cold calculation of it stands in stark contrast to the chaotic speed of the battle that surrounded it. This was not the spontaneous violence of close combat. This was something more deliberate, more organized, more consciously evil. The perpetrators of the Malmedy massacre have never been entirely identified, and this remains one of the most contested aspects of the historical record. German soldiers from multiple units in Peiper's column were in the area at the time, and evidence suggests that men from different companies participated in the killings. Some accounts point to officers or non-commissioned officers who ordered or directly executed prisoners. Others describe a kind of contagion of violence that spread through groups of soldiers who had been fighting without sleep or rest for nearly 24 hours. What cannot be disputed, however, is that these killings happened under Peiper's command and within his area of responsibility. Whether he personally ordered the massacre, tacitly approved it, or simply did not prevent it when he might have, remains a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that his name would become inseparable from the event, fairly or unfairly, for the remainder of his life. In the immediate aftermath, the news of the massacre spread rapidly through American units. Soldiers who had surrendered, or who learned of the fate of their comrades, began to resist German capture. Stories circulated, grew in the telling, and hardened into conviction that German soldiers, particularly SS men, could not be taken prisoner without risk. This psychological impact rippled outward through the American ranks, stiffening resistance and diminishing the likelihood that future German advances would be met with quick surrender. Peiper's column, which had achieved its initial breakthrough through aggression and shock, now faced American soldiers who fought more desperately because they believed that surrender itself was a death sentence. The massacre had undermined the very mechanism that typically ends combat in a localized area, replacing negotiated surrender with fight to the death. Whether this was the result of deliberate German strategy or uncontrolled violence by men pushed to psychological extremes remains an open historical question, but the consequence was clear. American resistance hardened considerably. Peiper himself, by his own subsequent accounts, did not witness the massacre directly. He was forward with his lead elements, concerned with maintaining momentum and breaking through the American resistance that was beginning to coalesce around key positions. His command was spread over many kilometers of road, and the column was in constant motion, constantly adapting to new American positions and new threats. It is entirely plausible that atrocities occurring in the rear or flanks of such a large, fast-moving formation could escape the immediate knowledge of the commanding officer. Yet command responsibility is not measured solely by personal witness or direct orders. A commander is responsible for the overall conduct of his men and for the discipline and behavior of his unit. By this standard, and by the standards of military law and international convention, Peiper bore at least some responsibility for what happened in his name, even if the precise degree of his knowledge or complicity has never been definitively established. This ambiguity would plague him in the years to come. The American soldiers who survived the massacre became witnesses to history. In the days and weeks following their capture and eventual liberation by advancing American forces, they provided detailed statements to investigators. Military police and later war crimes investigators interviewed survivors, documented the scene of the killings, collected physical evidence, and attempted to identify perpetrators. The Soviet government would later claim far higher casualty figures and use the massacre as propaganda, but the American investigators conducted a relatively disciplined inquiry based on eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence. The photographs of the bodies lying in the snow and in the frozen fields near Malmedy became some of the most iconic and disturbing images of the entire war. They showed young men, American soldiers, cold and still, their uniforms covered with snow, their lives ended without warning or mercy on a hillside in Belgium. These images would define the massacre in the public memory and would define Peiper's legacy in ways that no amount of military accomplishment could overcome. The immediate military impact of Malmedy on Peiper's campaign was complex. The news of the massacre did not stop his advance that day. In fact, his column continued westward, achieving further penetration into the American rear area. The psychological shock of the massacre worked in the short term to Peiper's advantage, creating confusion and fear that paralyzed some American units. But this advantage was temporary and ultimately superficial. The massacre transformed Peiper, in the minds of American soldiers and commanders, from a formidable military adversary into something far more sinister, a practitioner of atrocity, a commander who could not be trusted, a soldier who had crossed the line from warfare into war crime. This transformation of perception, justified or not, meant that his remaining days of freedom were already beginning to run out. The massacre had purchased him perhaps one more day of tactical advantage, but at the cost of his permanent moral standing in the eyes of his enemies and, eventually, in the eyes of history. As Peiper's column continued its advance deeper into the Ardennes, as it fought at Stoumont and struggled against American reinforcements, the knowledge of Malmedy spread through Allied ranks. Intelligence officers added the massacre to their growing list of German atrocities and war crimes. Peiper's name, previously known only to military specialists and intelligence analysts, began to appear in broader context as an officer whose unit had committed significant violations of the laws of war. When he was eventually captured, after the collapse of the German offensive and the final retreat into Germany, the investigators already knew what to look for. They already understood that Peiper's command had perpetrated a documented massacre of American prisoners. The trail of witnesses was fresh, the evidence was abundant, and the crime was incontestable. The Malmedy massacre stands as a moment where individual acts of violence and command responsibility intersect in ways that remain philosophically and legally complex. Modern military justice attempts to distinguish between what a commander orders, what he knowingly permits, and what he fails to prevent through negligence or overextension of authority. In Peiper's case, all three aspects would be debated in the years following the war. What is undeniable, from a moral standpoint, is that men under his command murdered prisoners, that these murders were preventable, and that Peiper's name has been forever associated with this crime. Whether this association represents accurate history or a kind of convenient scapegoating for larger systemic failures remains contested. What cannot be contested is that approximately 80 American soldiers died at Malmedy, that their deaths were unjustifiable by any military or legal standard, and that the event changed the course of Peiper's life and legacy. In the larger context of the war and of the Holocaust, Malmedy occupies a particular place in the historical record. It was not systematic genocide. It was not the industrial killing of an entire people. It was a discrete atrocity, a moment where military discipline broke down or where deliberate orders were given to execute prisoners. In the framework of war crimes and crimes against humanity, it is significant but not unprecedented. German soldiers had committed similar massacres in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. American and Soviet soldiers had themselves committed atrocities that received less scrutiny and less legal accountability. Yet Malmedy became famous, documented, litigated, and mythologized in ways that many other wartime killings did not. This visibility would prove both a burden and a kind of recognition for Peiper. He would be remembered for Malmedy before he was remembered for any of his tactical accomplishments or military achievements. The massacre had claimed not just his prisoners, but his future as well. The winter afternoon of the 17th of December faded into darkness, and Peiper's column pressed onward towards Stoumont and the limits of their advance. Behind them, in the snow and frozen fields near the village of Malmedy, lay the evidence of what had occurred. American soldiers moving into the area would discover the bodies and begin the work of documenting, investigating, and remembering. The fact of the massacre was established almost immediately. What remained uncertain were the details of command, the chain of responsibility, and the moral and legal consequences that would flow from it. These questions would occupy investigators, prosecutors, judges, and historians for decades to come. As Peiper drove deeper into the Ardennes, hunting for fuel and a breakthrough that would never come, he left behind more than abandoned vehicles and exhausted soldiers. He left behind the ghosts of Malmedy, ghosts that would follow him for the rest of his life, and that would make his name, in the end, a byword for the moment when military glory and human atrocity touched in the snow of a Belgian winter. The morning after Malmedy brought no pause to Joachim Peiper's relentless westward push. His column had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The atrocity that had unfolded on that frozen crossroad was already being whispered through American ranks, carried by survivors who had witnessed the impossible, their comrades shot down in cold blood while standing helpless with their hands raised. Yet for Peiper himself, the massacred prisoners represented merely an episode in the larger drama of his offensive. The tanks still rolled, the fuel still burned, the kilometers still accumulated westward, and in that momentum lay his only chance of success. The German High Command had given him a mission of almost mythical ambition: break through, drive deep into the Belgian rear, sever the American armies, reach Antwerp. Everything depended on velocity. Every hour lost was an hour the Allies could marshal reinforcements. Every kilometer gained was a kilometer closer to the dream of a German victory that might reverse the entire war. Peiper understood this calculus with the clarity of a man who had spent 5 years fighting in the mechanized warfare of the Eastern Front. Speed was survival. Hesitation was death. On the 19th of December, Peiper's Kampfgruppe, his battle group, that organic assembly of tanks, armored infantry, anti-tank guns and supply vehicles, continued its assault through the Ardennes. The weather had turned brutally cold, the sky overcast and heavy with snow that fell intermittently and covered the landscape in white. This presented a tactical paradox that Peiper recognized even as he exploited it. The snow slowed movement and made navigation treacherous, yet it also limited American air power. German planes had been barely visible since the offensive began on the 16th, but the Luftwaffe remained a phantom threat to any static target. American aircraft, by contrast, could operate with greater frequency as long as visibility allowed. The overcast conditions that grounded many flights were a merciful respite, but Peiper knew that clear skies could return at any moment, and when they did, his mechanized column, stretching for over 100 kilometers along narrow Belgian roads, would become a shooting gallery for Allied fighters. The race against the weather was as much a part of the battle as the race against American reinforcements. The resistance Peiper encountered hardened with each passing day. The initial breakthrough had caught the American lines in confusion and disarray, with isolated units scattered across the forward positions of the First Army. But American commanders were quick learners, and General Omar Bradley's intelligence officers began to understand within hours that this was not a minor raid or local counteroffensive. This was a major German operation, possibly the beginning of a desperate strategic gamble to reverse the entire Western Front. Orders flowed down the chain of command to establish blocking positions, to concentrate reserves, to slow the German advance long enough for higher headquarters to fully mobilize. By the 19th of December, American armor and mechanized infantry began to appear in Peiper's path with greater frequency. Small battles erupted at crossroads and villages that Peiper's column had crossed almost unopposed just 2 days earlier. German soldiers who had expected easy passage through a broken enemy suddenly found themselves facing organized defense, anti-tank guns well positioned on hills and ridgelines, American riflemen fighting from ruined buildings with the grim determination of men defending their own supply lines and rear areas. The psychological impact of these encounters cannot be underestimated. German soldiers in Peiper's Kampfgruppe had been promised a breakthrough, a smashing victory, a reversal of the grinding defeats of the past 2 years on the Eastern Front. Instead, they were finding American resistance growing stronger by the hour. The initial euphoria of the first 48 hours, the sense that they had finally achieved the impossible breakthrough, began to give way to creeping doubt. Peiper himself drove his men with an iron discipline that bordered on brutality. He moved constantly among his columns, by half-track and on foot, exhorting officers to drive faster, to bypass resistance where possible, to concentrate force on weak points and break through. His reputation as a hard commander preceded him. His soldiers feared him, respected him, and obeyed him. Yet even the most disciplined army has limits, and the men of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment had been pushed to the edge of exhaustion. They had been fighting continuously for 4 days without adequate rest, on rations that were barely sufficient, in conditions that grew more bitter with each passing night. Fuel emerged as the other silent enemy that stalked Peiper's advance. The grand strategic calculation that had driven the Ardennes Offensive assumed that German spearheads would capture American supply dumps as they drove westward, seizing intact fuel stocks and ammunition to sustain their advance deep into the Belgian rear. This assumption was catastrophically flawed. American commanders, understanding from the first hours of the offensive that this was no minor incursion, had issued standing orders to destroy fuel supplies rather than let them fall into German hands. Depot after depot that Peiper's scouts located had been torched by American engineers, leaving nothing but smoking ruins and charred drums. The few supply dumps that fell intact into German hands provided only temporary relief. The distances being covered were immense. A panzer column advancing over 100 kilometers in 2 days burned fuel at a prodigious rate. The half-tracks and tanks that had rolled so triumphantly across the Ardennes in the first exhilarating hours of the offensive now consumed fuel faster than supply lines could deliver it. Peiper was burning through his reserves with every kilometre westward, and he knew it. The math was grimly simple. If the breakthrough did not achieve critical success within the next few days, the advance would simply run out of fuel and grind to a halt, far short of Antwerp. By the 20th of December, Peiper's columns had advanced nearly 100 kilometres from their starting positions. This was a remarkable distance by any measure of modern warfare, but it was falling dramatically short of the objectives that German High Command had envisioned. The original operational plans had called for a rapid push to the Meuse River and beyond into the Belgian countryside. Peiper was still in the Ardennes proper, moving through towns and villages whose names meant nothing to him and less to the grand strategy of German victory. Yet he drove onward with characteristic aggression, pushing his men and machines to the limit. He was acutely aware that the initiative was his, that every moment he continued to advance and score tactical successes was a moment stolen from American ability to organize a coherent defense. American reinforcements were arriving, but so were German reinforcements from the south. German units moving to widen the breakthrough and exploit the initial gap in the American line. The offensive had not yet reached its moment of crisis. The breakthrough still had viability. The dream of reaching Antwerp, while increasingly tenuous, was not yet dead. American armor began to concentrate in Peiper's path, with the weight and purpose of a fist closing. The 101st Airborne Division, hastily mobilized from its billets in France, was racing northward to Bastogne, a crucial crossroads that sat astride the German lines of supply and communication. Armoured columns of the 10th Armoured Division and other mechanized units were deploying to block and delay the German spearheads. Tank engagements became more frequent and more violent. Peiper's Panthers and Tigers, among the finest tanks in the world, still possessed superior armour and firepower compared to most American Shermans. Yet numbers were beginning to matter more than individual tank quality. American reinforcements arrived in increasing quantities, and Peiper's losses could not be replaced. Every tank abandoned for lack of fuel was a tank that could not be recovered. Every soldier killed or wounded further reduced the effective strength of the Kampfgruppe, and replacements were not forthcoming from German rear areas. The villages and crossroads through which Peiper's column passed bore the marks of a war that was changing shape before his eyes. The Americans were no longer confused and scattered. They were organizing, reinforcing, establishing defensive lines. The illusion of a broken enemy that could be swept aside by a determined thrust had evaporated. What remained was the grinding reality of mechanized warfare in which numbers, logistics, and staying power counted as much as tactical brilliance. Peiper's aggressive tactics and his personal example had driven his men farther and faster than anyone had predicted. He had achieved a remarkable penetration of American lines. But the breakthrough was not achieving the strategic breakthrough that the entire offensive depended upon. The German High Command in distant headquarters had gambled everything on the assumption that American morale would collapse, that the armies of the West would fracture under the shock of a massive German attack in their rear. Instead, American units were fighting with skill and determination, using terrain to multiply their strength, slowing the German advance through disciplined resistance and clever deployment. The weather, which had initially favored German operations by limiting American air power, now became an increasingly critical factor in Peiper's calculations. Forecasts suggested that clearing conditions might arrive within the next few days. When the skies cleared, American fighters and fighter bombers would emerge in devastating numbers, operating from bases in France and across the liberated territories of Western Europe. Peiper's column, stretched across over 100 kilometers of narrow Belgian roads and forests, would be uniquely vulnerable to air attack. A few days of clear weather and concentrated American air operations could eliminate his entire Kampfgruppe, turning him from a fearsome spearhead into a mobile target range. This knowledge weighed on his mind even as he continued to drive forward. He was racing not only against American ground forces, but against the calendar itself. He had perhaps 48 to 72 hours before weather and reinforcements combined to make any further westward advance impossible. The strategic situation that had seemed so promising on the morning of the 16th of December was deteriorating with alarming speed. Peiper's soldiers fought with the desperation of men who sensed that the grand promise of breakthrough was becoming unattainable. They had been told that the American armies would collapse, that a rapid thrust toward Antwerp would split the Allies and force a negotiated settlement. Instead, they were finding themselves in an increasingly difficult position, cut off from their own reinforcements by the width of the Ardennes, facing growing American resistance, running dangerously low on fuel and ammunition. The young SS men who had volunteered for the elite 1st SS Panzer Regiment had imagined themselves to be the spearhead of German victory. They were discovering instead that they were the expendable tip of a desperate gamble by a regime that was rationing its last reserves of fighting strength. Yet discipline held. The German soldier, whatever his doubts or fears, obeyed his orders and continued to advance when commanded. Peiper drove them forward with a commander's will that could not acknowledge failure. To stop was to accept defeat. To continue was at least to preserve the possibility of breakthrough, no matter how remote that possibility had become. By the evening of the 20th of December, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had covered more than 100 kilometers in less than 5 days of continuous combat. This was a remarkable achievement by any standard of modern warfare. German panzer forces had moved faster and struck harder than American commanders had believed possible. Yet the grand design of the Ardennes offensive was already in doubt. Other German spearheads farther south were making progress, but none had achieved the same depth of penetration as Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Regiment. American reserves were arriving and consolidating. The initial shock and disorganization that had characterized the first hours of the German assault were giving way to organized defense and coordinated counterattack. Peiper continued to advance, but the tactical picture was becoming increasingly desperate. Every hour that passed was an hour that fuel stocks dwindled. Every kilometer covered was a kilometer that stretched German supply lines even thinner. The dream of breaking through to Antwerp and splitting the American armies was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of mounting evidence that the American army, while surprised and disrupted, was far from beaten. The momentum that had carried the Germans so far westward in the first 2 days was beginning to dissipate. The resistance that had seemed light and easily overcome was stiffening with each passing engagement. Peiper pressed forward because there was no alternative. To retreat was to surrender the initiative entirely. To stop was to invite encirclement and destruction. The only option remaining was to drive deeper into the Belgian rear and pray that somewhere ahead the Americans would finally break, that somewhere beyond the next ridge or village the road to Antwerp would open before him. It was a desperate hope, but it was all that remained. The narrow roads of the Ardennes had narrowed further still by the time Peiper's spearhead approached Stoumont on the 21st of December. His columns had driven westward through snow and darkness for 5 days, covering ground that seemed at first to promise breakthrough, then began to reveal itself as a trap, closing slowly around him. The optimism of the 16th of December, when German artillery had torn open weakly held American positions and Peiper's tanks had burst through like water through a fractured dam, had given way to something grimmer, the recognition that time itself had become an enemy. Behind him, American reinforcements were pouring northward from Luxembourg and southward from the north, converging on the Ardennes bulge like opposing armies of chess pieces. Ahead of him lay Stoumont, a farming village of no particular strategic significance save for one terrible fact. It blocked the only road that led westward toward Antwerp, toward the dream that had sustained the German offensive for 5 days and nights. Stoumont sat on the western rim of a shallow valley, its stone buildings clustered around a small church and a handful of farms scattered across open fields. The terrain around it was not ideal for armor, broken by hedgerows and dense woodland, favoring defensive positions. But it was the ground Peiper had to fight across if he meant to continue westward at all. By the time his reconnaissance elements approached the village, American forces had already begun to consolidate there. A squadron of Sherman tanks from the 84th Infantry Division had arrived on the 20th of December, and they were dug in along the western approaches to the town, their guns commanding the approaches from elevated positions. Infantry squads occupied the buildings and took positions in the surrounding woods. The American commander on the ground understood what Peiper understood. Stoumont was no longer undefended. It had become a checkpoint, a place where breakthrough stopped and where the German spearhead would have to expend men, ammunition, and time that it could never recover. Peiper's situation by this point had become precarious, in ways that high command in Berlin could never fully appreciate. His original command had numbered roughly 2,000 men and officers in tanks, half-tracks, armored cars and trucks. 5 days of continuous combat, harassment from American aircraft, and the simple attrition of mechanized warfare had reduced his strength considerably. More critically, his fuel situation had become acute. The entire operation had been predicated on the assumption that German forces would capture American fuel depots during the breakthrough, replenishing themselves as they drove westward. That assumption had collided with reality. American units had destroyed or moved their fuel supplies, and Peiper's vehicles were now running on reserves that dwindled with each kilometer traveled. Some of his trucks had already been abandoned. Some of his half-tracks had been cannibalized for parts. The aggressive advance that had seemed so audacious on the 16th of December was consuming resources at a pace that no supply line could hope to match, especially given that the roads behind him were contested and German logistics were already at the breaking point. The American response to Peiper's breakthrough had been confusion initially, then organization. By the time he reached Stoumont, the American 7th Armored Division and the 83rd Infantry Division were closing from the north. The 2nd Armored Division was pressing upward from the south. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces in the central sector, had begun to see the German thrust not as an existential threat, but as an opportunity. A concentrated German spearhead could be encircled, trapped, and destroyed if American forces could catch it before it dispersed. Peiper did not know this yet, but he sensed it. He sensed that the window of opportunity that had existed on the 16th of December was closing. He sensed that the surprise and confusion that had carried him this far were dissipating. He sensed, perhaps, that he had reached a point beyond which continued advance was no longer possible. The battle for Stoumont began in earnest on the morning of the 21st of December. Peiper committed his armor and mechanized infantry to a direct assault on the village from the east, driving toward the American positions with the same brutal directness that had worked in previous engagements. The first clash between German tanks and American Shermans took place on the outskirts of the village, in fields still partially frozen from the previous night's snow. German Panther and Tiger tanks, heavier and more heavily armed than the American Shermans, initially pressed the advantage, but American artillery was present, and American reinforcements were arriving hourly. The fighting was sharp and intense, lasting through the day and into the darkness. German soldiers pressed forward through the woods on either side of the main road, but American infantrymen held their positions in buildings and foxholes, using the broken terrain to offset the German advantage in armor. By nightfall, Peiper's assault had failed to break through completely. The village remained in American hands. German forces held some of the eastern approaches, but could not penetrate to the western side. Peiper attempted a different approach on the 22nd of December. Rather than assault the village directly, he attempted to bypass it, driving his columns northwestward through the forests in hopes of finding a route around American positions. This maneuver consumed precious fuel and precious time. It also put his columns at greater risk. Stripped of the protection of the main road and the armored spearhead, his supporting units were more vulnerable to American air attack and to ambush from American infantry units that were now operating throughout the region with growing confidence and coordination. The attempt failed after covering only a few kilometers. The terrain simply would not permit passage of the heavy vehicles that comprised his command. Peiper was forced to order a withdrawal back toward the main road, toward the confrontation at Stoumont that he could not avoid. The realization that further westward advance was becoming impossible began to crystallize in Peiper's mind around this time. He was not a man given to self-deception or to the fantasy thinking that pervaded higher German command. He had fought long enough on the Eastern Front to recognize the moment when tactical momentum was irretrievably lost. He knew that fuel was running low. He knew that American reinforcements were arriving faster than German strategy had anticipated. He knew that his original command of 2,000 men had been whittled down to fewer than 1,500 fighting soldiers. He knew that his heavy armor, which had been his primary advantage, was becoming a liability as fuel grew scarcer and enemy pressure mounted from multiple directions. The intelligence reports he was receiving painted a picture of American forces encircling the Ardennes Bulge in a massive pincer movement. Stoumont was not a waypoint on the road to Antwerp. It was the wall against which the German breakthrough had finally collided. Yet Peiper continued to fight at Stoumont because he had no better option available to him. To retreat was to abandon the offensive entirely. To remain in place was to invite encirclement. To press forward was to expend the last reserves of his strength in an assault that intelligence suggested would fail. He chose to press forward, throwing his remaining armor and infantry at American positions with the same aggressive tactics that had worked in previous engagements. On the 23rd of December, German forces mounted a renewed assault on Stoumont, committing tanks, panzer grenadiers, and supporting infantry in a coordinated attack aimed at breaking American resistance and opening the road westward once more. The assault was fierce and costly. German tanks pushed into the western portions of the village. German infantry advanced through the streets and through the buildings, engaging American soldiers at close range. But American reinforcements continued to arrive. The American 2nd Armored Division had moved pieces into the area. American infantry divisions were pressing northward. The weight of American numbers and firepower, once assembled, proved overwhelming. The German assault stalled. The village remained unconquered. By the 24th of December, it had become clear, even to the most optimistic German officers, that the Ardennes offensive had reached its culminating point and begun its inevitable decline. The grand strategy that Hitler had approved, a deep penetration that would split Allied armies and force negotiation, had been reduced to a series of isolated breakthroughs that were being systematically contained and compressed. Peiper's column, which had been intended as the spearhead of German victory, was now surrounded on three sides by American forces and blocked to the west by American armor at Stoumont. He had fuel for perhaps one more day of heavy combat. He had ammunition that was adequate but not abundant. He had men who were exhausted, cold, and increasingly aware that victory had become impossible. The question that now consumed his mind was not how to break through to Antwerp, but how to preserve his command from destruction. The failure at Stoumont represented not merely a tactical setback, but the end of German hopes in the Ardennes. The offensive would continue to be fought until the end of December, but the strategic initiative had passed irretrievably to the Americans. The time for breakthrough had passed. What remained was only the slow process of containment, compression, and eventual collapse. Peiper would spend one more night attempting to hold his positions around Stoumont on the 24th of December, knowing that continued resistance was futile, but having no alternative except to order his men to begin preparation for withdrawal. The dream of Antwerp had evaporated. The dream of splitting Allied armies had become impossible. What remained was only the harder question: how to save his men from annihilation. That question would drive the events of the next day and push Peiper into a decision that would define the final phase of his military career and shape the historical judgment that would follow his surrender. By the 21st of December, Joachim Peiper understood what military commanders fear most: the trap closing around him. His spearhead, once a knife point piercing through American confusion, had become a fist trapped inside a closing hand. Stoumont lay before him like a locked gate, and behind him, American forces were consolidating, reorganizing, and preparing to crush his extended column. Fuel shipments that should have arrived from the German rear never materialized. His panzer crews rationed gasoline with the desperation of dying men rationing water. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp within days had stalled barely 80 kilometers from its starting point, and Peiper faced a choice that no commander welcomes: retreat or annihilation. The weather, which had favored German operations by grounding Allied air superiority in the first days of the offensive, began to clear on the 23rd of December. By dawn on the 24th, the sky opened to Allied fighters and bombers. American P-47 Thunderbolts descended on the German column like vultures, their guns tearing through vehicles and men with methodical efficiency. The psychological effect was catastrophic. Peiper's soldiers, accustomed to German air dominance or at worst neutral skies, suddenly faced an enemy that controlled the very air above them. German anti-aircraft guns, spread thin across the extended column, could not protect everyone. Officers watched helplessly as their vehicles exploded in fountains of flame and twisted metal. The road became a graveyard of abandoned trucks, half-tracks, and tanks, some still burning, others already silent and cold. On the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, Peiper called his commanders to a conference. The conversation was brief and grim. Further advance westward was impossible. American forces under General Courtney Hodges' First Army, reinforced by units from Third Army, had established blocking positions that could not be broken with his remaining strength. The supply situation was critical. He had perhaps enough fuel for tactical maneuvers, but none for a sustained drive. German High Command, already distressed by the failure of the broader offensive, offered no reinforcements, no breakthrough spearhead, nothing but orders to hold position. Peiper made his decision. His column would fight eastward toward German lines. He would abandon the tanks that ran dry, the vehicles that could not move, and all the equipment that could not be carried on a soldier's back. What had begun as a lightning strike would end as a desperate breakout through enemy encirclement. The order to withdraw spread through the surviving units of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment like a shock. Soldiers who had fought through 2 days of intense combat, who had endured air attacks and American resistance with the expectation of eventual breakthrough, now learned they were leaving the battlefield. The psychological blow was profound. Discipline held, but barely. Officers had to suppress growing panic and prevent wholesale collapse of morale. Peiper moved through the column on foot and vehicle, speaking to his men with the quiet authority that had sustained them through months of fighting. He did not promise them they would survive. He promised them only that they would fight together and that their officers would not abandon them. For soldiers trapped in a collapsing offensive, it was almost enough. The withdrawal began on the evening of the 24th of December. Peiper's vehicles that still possessed fuel or could be towed were consolidated. The rest were methodically destroyed so they could not fall intact into American hands. Engines were sabotaged, fuel tanks were drained and ignited, and vehicles were pushed off roads into ravines. The fires burned through the winter night like funeral pyres for a failed offensive. Peiper's medical personnel were ordered to remain behind with wounded soldiers who could not travel. Their fate would depend on American mercy. Supplies that could not be carried were burned. The column was stripped of everything not essential to survival or combat. By dawn on the 25th of December, Peiper was ready to move his surviving soldiers through enemy lines. The route eastward led through forests and across frozen terrain that had not been heavily fortified by American forces. Peiper chose a line of advance that avoided the main roads where American armor concentrated. His column moved in small groups and files, less like a military unit than like refugees fleeing a burning city. The cold was merciless. Men wrapped themselves in blankets torn from vehicles and tried to keep moving despite exhaustion that bordered on delirium. Soldiers fell and had to be helped to their feet by comrades. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Hunger gnawed at everyone. The rations had been consumed days ago, and there was no food to be found in the frozen forest. Yet the column kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant either freezing or capture. American forces, recognizing the German withdrawal, set up roadblocks across the column's path. Fighting broke out repeatedly as Peiper's soldiers encountered American positions and had to fight through them or find routes around them. The combat was brutal and close. Soldiers fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets at ranges where precision became less important than aggression. Peiper moved among his men, directing fire and organizing assaults on American positions. He was wounded during this fighting, but refused evacuation, continuing to command from the front as his column battered its way through successive roadblocks. American soldiers, tough and determined, fought back with the knowledge that they were hunting a trapped enemy. Several times the column was nearly surrounded completely, and only quick tactical decisions and aggressive counterattacks prevented encirclement. The forest itself became both enemy and ally. It concealed the German column from air attack, but also channeled movement into predictable routes where Americans could set ambushes. Men became separated from their units in the darkness and confusion, disappearing into the frozen woods. Some found their way back, others did not. Groups of stragglers formed throughout the forest, some eventually reaching German lines, others captured by American patrols or freezing in the woods. Peiper had lost command and control over much of his extended column. His authority now extended only as far as his voice could carry through the chaos. Officers at the front made decisions in real time without waiting for orders. The withdrawal became less an organized military retreat than a desperate scramble for survival, in which the strong and determined lived and the weak fell behind. By the morning of the 25th of December, Peiper's advance elements encountered German forces that had held their defensive positions in the eastern portion of the Ardennes. The trap had not closed completely. A narrow corridor remained through which the survivors could pass. His lead groups broke through American positions one final time and reached the safety of German-held territory. Behind them came the main body of the column, battered and bleeding, but still fighting. American forces, recognizing that the main body would soon break through their line, began to concentrate firepower for a final attempt to cut off the column. Artillery fire intensified. Machine guns lashed the forest trails. American soldiers pressed forward, trying to collapse the corridor. But Peiper's rear guard, composed of his hardest soldiers and commanded by his most capable subordinates, held the American advance just long enough. By Christmas afternoon, the remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment stumbled across the line, separating American-held and German-held territory. Peiper emerged from the forest with approximately 600 survivors of the 2,000 men and officers who had begun the offensive 9 days earlier. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or missing in the forest. The vehicles that had survived the breakout numbered in the dozens out of the hundreds that had crossed into Belgium. The supplies were gone. The offensive momentum had evaporated. German military leadership, surveying the wreckage of the Ardennes campaign, confronted the reality that their last gamble for victory in the West had failed utterly. Peiper, exhausted and wounded, reported to higher command and received orders to reform his remaining soldiers for defensive operations in the contracting German defensive perimeter. The cost of the breakout was measured in more than lost men and equipment. Peiper's reputation, built on years of aggressive panzer command, now carried the weight of the Malmedy massacre and the other alleged atrocities during the offensive. As his soldiers stumbled out of the forest on Christmas Day, American investigators were already collecting witness testimony about the killings. The spotlight of war crimes investigation was beginning to narrow and focus. Within weeks, Peiper would learn that he was now hunted not just as an enemy commander, but as a man accused of directing the murder of prisoners. The military victory he might have claimed for breaking out of encirclement and preserving part of his command would be entirely overshadowed by questions about what his column had done to American soldiers who had been captured and then killed. The 25th of December also marked a subtle shift in Peiper's role in the remaining months of war. He was no longer the aggressive spearhead commanding Germany's elite armored units in a push for operational breakthrough. Instead, he would command fragments of forces in increasingly futile defensive battles as the Wehrmacht contracted toward final collapse. The man who had learned to lead in the vast spaces of the Russian steppes and the lightning campaigns of the West now prepared to defend fortified positions against enemies with infinite resources and determination. His military brilliance, which had been suited to maneuver and exploitation, would find no outlet in the static, attritional warfare of Germany's final stand. The breakout from the Ardennes, achieved at such cost, had merely postponed the reckoning that awaited him. The Ardennes offensive had consumed itself in the snow and mud of the Belgian winter. What had begun as Germany's last great gamble for victory had collapsed into confusion, retreat, and desperation. Peiper's column, once a spearhead of German power, now existed as fragments, scattered vehicles, exhausted soldiers, and the remnants of command structure held together by will alone. The original force of nearly 2,000 men under his command had been shattered across 100 kilometers of contested territory. Tanks sat abandoned where fuel ran out. Half-tracks lay burning on roadside embankments. The column that had punched through American lines with such ferocity now moved backward through the same terrain, pursued by enemies who grew stronger with each passing hour. Peiper himself was not the same officer who had begun the offensive. His face bore the marks of sleeplessness and the weight of decisions that could not be undone. On the 25th of December, after days of fighting and maneuvering through American positions, Peiper's remaining force, roughly 600 men from his original 2,000, made contact with German lines. The reunion was not triumphant. These soldiers emerged from the forest cold, hungry, and depleted, their vehicles gone, their ammunition nearly exhausted. Peiper reported to his superiors in the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and what transpired in those debriefings remains historically significant. He had failed to achieve the breakthrough that Hitler demanded. He had failed to reach Antwerp. He had covered impressive ground, fought with tactical skill, but ultimately the offensive had stalled and been contained. German High Command understood the implications. The Ardennes Offensive, which was meant to split the Allies and deliver Germany time to negotiate peace, instead demonstrated that Germany no longer possessed the resources or manpower to achieve strategic objectives. The moment when Germany might have won the war had passed. Peiper, despite his personal bravery and considerable tactical ability, could not reverse this larger reality. What Peiper could not have known in those immediate hours was that his escape from the Ardennes would not mark an escape from accountability. Even as his exhausted column fought its way back toward German lines, witnesses to the violence committed during the offensive were coming forward. American soldiers who had survived the encounter near Malmedy village carried knowledge that would outlast the war. Survivors among the approximately 80 American prisoners killed in that incident had already begun describing what happened. Medics and officers who had processed the bodies were recording details. Photographs were being taken. The machinery of Allied war crimes investigation, still relatively new in 1944, was already being activated. Within days of Peiper's retreat, American investigators were being dispatched to the Ardennes region to collect evidence and testimony. The spotlight had not yet found him fully, but it was turning in his direction. The immediate post-offensive period saw Peiper's unit reformed and repositioned for continued defensive operations. German forces were reorganizing for a fighting withdrawal as Soviet and American armies pressed relentlessly inward toward German territory. Peiper remained in command of combat forces, though now those forces were ever-shrinking remnants of their former strength. Battles continued through January 1945 in the snow and mountains of eastern Belgium and western Germany. He was still being treated as a capable officer by his superiors, still being assigned responsibility for frontline command. Yet somewhere behind the lines, in American-held territory, investigators were working methodically. They were interviewing survivors. They were photographing the site near Malmedy, where bodies had been found. They were collecting names and identifying the units responsible. Peiper's name appeared frequently in early witness accounts. His regiment's designation was noted. The 1st SS Panzer Regiment under Peiper's command had been identified as the unit through whose lines the American prisoners had passed just before they were killed. The nature of what occurred at Malmedy on the 17th of December remained contested and complex. The immediate circumstances were chaotic. An American artillery observation unit had been overrun. Prisoners had been captured. Then, in circumstances that witnesses described differently depending on their perspective and position, those prisoners had been killed. Some American survivors claimed they witnessed deliberate execution. Some described panicked gunfire as prisoners attempted to escape. Some testified that SS soldiers had fired at point-blank range into helpless men. German witnesses who survived the war offered different versions. Some claimed the American prisoners had attempted to flee and had been shot while trying to escape. Some said they had no knowledge of the incident. Some claimed higher officers had ordered the killing. The historical record suggests that what occurred was not a single moment of decision, but rather an escalation of violence, in which command structure broke down, individual soldiers made lethal choices, and chaos overwhelmed whatever restraints or orders might have existed. Yet the historical record also indicates that approximately 80 American soldiers died in and around that location in circumstances that, by any standard, constituted a war crime. Peiper's direct responsibility for the Malmedy massacre remained ambiguous in ways that would haunt investigations and trials for years to come. He was not present at Malmedy. He did not personally order the killings that are known to have occurred. He was several kilometers ahead of the location where the Americans were captured and executed. Yet his column had committed the act. Soldiers under his command had pulled triggers. The unit responsible operated within his sphere of responsibility and authority. Questions that would follow Peiper for the rest of his life emerged immediately from these facts. Did he know what had happened to those prisoners after they were captured? Did he order it, even indirectly? Did he condone it? Did he attempt to investigate or punish those responsible? Did he attempt to conceal what had happened? These were questions that Peiper would face repeatedly in the years following the war, and his answers would never fully satisfy those who believed his unit had committed atrocities, or those who believed he was being unfairly blamed for the actions of subordinates. Beyond Malmedy, other allegations emerged as Allied investigators expanded their work across the Ardennes battlefield. American soldiers reported other killings, other instances where German soldiers or SS men had executed prisoners or civilians. Not all of these incidents could be definitively linked to Peiper's command. Some occurred in areas his column had passed through. Some involved units moving in parallel or behind his spearhead. Some involved soldiers from other SS Panzer units. Yet the cumulative effect was to create an image of Peiper's offensive as characterized by exceptional brutality and disregard for military law and the laws of war. Whether all of these accusations were accurate, whether all were attributable to Peiper's command, whether Peiper himself had knowledge of or ordered them, these remained contested questions. What was not contested was that violations had occurred and that Peiper's unit had been in proximity to many of them. As 1945 progressed and Germany faced final defeat, Peiper's name had already been placed on lists of suspected war criminals. Allied headquarters were collecting information, interrogation teams were being prepared, prosecutors were beginning to develop cases. Peiper himself did not disappear into obscurity or attempt to evade capture. He continued to serve in combat until the final collapse of German forces. He was captured by American soldiers in May 1945, and when he entered captivity, the Americans who held him understood his significance. They understood that this was an officer whose unit had been investigated for mass killings during the Ardennes Offensive. They understood that testimony from hundreds of American soldiers connected his name and his unit to the deaths near Malmedy and elsewhere. The machinery of justice that would eventually bring Peiper to trial was already set in motion. The passage from Peiper's escape from the Ardennes to his eventual trial was marked by careful documentation and deliberate investigation. He was held in a series of American prisoner of war camps and detention facilities. He was interrogated repeatedly. His movements during the Ardennes offensive were reconstructed, maps were consulted, timelines were established. The investigators sought to determine not only what had happened, but also what Peiper had known and what authority he had exercised over the men and units under his command. These were lawyers and investigators working in the immediate aftermath of war, while memories remained fresh and evidence was still obtainable. They were constructing the historical and legal record that would become the foundation for the trial that would follow. What made the investigation into Peiper's actions particularly significant was the scale and visibility of the Malmedy massacre itself. Among all the war crimes committed during the Second World War, the killing of approximately 80 American soldiers near Malmedy became one of the most thoroughly investigated and most publicly known. American survivors went home and told their stories. Newspapers published accounts. American public opinion was outraged by the knowledge that German soldiers had executed American prisoners. The massacre at Malmedy became a symbol of German brutality in the American understanding of the war. This meant that when Peiper came to trial, he would not be tried in obscurity. He would be tried in the glare of public attention, with the weight of American national feeling bearing down upon the proceedings. The man who had escaped the Ardennes with 600 survivors from 2,000 men now faced a different kind of battle, one in which his survival might depend not on tactical skill or courage under fire, but on the interpretation of testimony, the assessment of evidence, and the judgments of military tribunals. The retreat and reunion with German lines that seemed to mark the end of Peiper's active service as a field commander did not mark the end of his ordeal. In many ways, it marked a transition from one kind of conflict to another. The combat operations of the Ardennes Offensive would be analyzed, debated, and litigated for decades to come. The soldiers who had witnessed or participated in killings would carry those memories and would someday be called to testify. Peiper himself would have to account for what had occurred under his command. He would have to answer questions about authority, knowledge, intent, and responsibility. The legal and moral reckoning that had begun with the first American investigations in December 1944 would extend far into the post-war years. Peiper's escape from the Ardennes had been a tactical success and a strategic failure. His escape from accountability for the violence committed during that offensive would prove far more difficult, more prolonged, and more contested. The year 1945 moved toward its conclusion with German forces collapsing from every direction. Peiper fought in these final battles, but they were increasingly futile, increasingly desperate. The knowledge that the war was lost had penetrated even into German military command, though continued resistance persisted. Peiper's name was known to the Allies now not merely as a capable panzer commander, but as an officer whose unit stood accused of war crimes. This knowledge would shape everything that followed his surrender. When he gave himself up to American captors in May 1945, he was not simply a defeated German officer. He was a man already under suspicion, already investigated, already marked for judicial proceedings. The escape from the Ardennes had preserved his life and the lives of his surviving soldiers, but it had not freed him from responsibility. The investigation that began in December 1944 would result in charges, trial, conviction, and years of imprisonment. The military campaign was ending, but the legal reckoning was just beginning. The Ardennes offensive had failed, and Joachim Peiper knew it with absolute certainty by the final days of December 1944. What had begun as a desperate thrust toward Antwerp, a gamble that might have changed the trajectory of the entire war, had collapsed into a grinding retreat through snow and forest. The man who had commanded thousands now found himself overseeing the fragments of a shattered command, thousands of soldiers reduced to hundreds, vehicles abandoned in the mud and ice, ammunition running low, fuel nearly exhausted. The breakthrough he had achieved with such fury and aggression had been contained, then rolled back by American counterattacks and reinforcements that arrived with mechanized precision. Peiper's escape from encirclement on Christmas Eve 1944, fighting his way eastward on foot with surviving soldiers through darkness and constant fire, marked the end of any strategic hope. Yet the war itself continued, grinding forward into 1945 with inexorable momentum, and Peiper remained a soldier, bound to his oath and his position of command, even as the structure around him crumbled into dust. The new year opened upon a landscape transformed by catastrophe. Peiper returned to Germany, bearing the psychological weight of a commander who had come close to success, only to watch it slip away in a matter of days. His assignment in the opening weeks of 1945 took him to the Eastern Front, where the Soviet offensive had resumed with terrible force. The Wehrmacht was contracting from all directions, pushed westward by the Russians and eastward by the Americans and British, caught in a vice that tightened with each passing week. German high command was fragmenting. Some officers still spoke of miracle weapons and last stands, while others privately acknowledged that defeat was now not a possibility, but an absolute certainty, arriving on a predictable schedule. Peiper was placed in command of the 4th SS Panzer Corps, a unit that existed more in name than in operational reality. Skeletal formations cobbled together from survivors and reinforcements, lacking the cohesion and material strength that had once defined SS Panzer operations. He was ordered to defend positions in Poland and Hungary against the advancing Soviet armies, a task that was fundamentally impossible given the disparity in forces, yet he executed his orders with the professionalism that had defined his entire military career. The battles of early 1945 were characterized by a quality of futility that distinguished them sharply from the aggressive operations of earlier years. When Peiper and his subordinates engaged Soviet forces, they fought with tactical competence and occasional success in local engagements. But these victories meant nothing in the broader strategic context. The Soviet armies numbered in the millions. German forces had dwindled to a fraction of their former strength. Fuel was desperately scarce, ammunition rationed, replacement soldiers often untrained or physically unsuitable for combat. Peiper's units would fight, inflict casualties on the enemy, hold a position for hours or days, and then withdraw as Soviet pressure mounted. The psychological toll of constant retreat, of knowing that each battlefield victory was merely a temporary delay rather than any meaningful resistance, began to wear upon even the most hardened soldiers. Peiper himself recognized the reality with bitter clarity. He was not fighting for victory or even for a negotiated peace, but rather fighting to delay, to maintain discipline and order in the face of approaching annihilation. This shift in purpose, from aggressive advancement to managing inevitable defeat, represented a fundamental alteration in the nature of his command. By February and March of 1945, the tempo of operations accelerated as Soviet forces drove deeper into German territory. Peiper was relocated to the Rhine Valley in western Germany, where American forces were preparing to cross the great river that had served as Germany's last meaningful defensive barrier. He was assigned to defend against what everyone understood would be the final massive assault by the Western Allies, and he positioned his scattered forces along the eastern bank of the Rhine, attempting to organize resistance from a depleted and demoralized command structure. The soldiers under his authority were now a mixture of hardened veterans and Hitler Youth conscripts, some as young as 16 or 17, forced into uniform in the final desperate weeks of the war. Many harbored no illusions about survival. They had grown up in the Nazi system, had been told from childhood that they would conquer nations, and now found themselves defending homeland territory against enemies who vastly outnumbered and outgunned them. Peiper maintained strict discipline even as the framework of military authority began to fragment around him. He issued orders knowing they would likely prove futile, organized defensive positions that would be overwhelmed, and moved his troops from one threatened sector to another as intelligence reports arrived of new Allied advances and crossings. The Allied crossing of the Rhine came in late March 1945, and when American forces established bridgeheads on the eastern bank, Peiper's defensive line collapsed into chaos. What had been intended as an organized withdrawal became instead a rout as Allied air power, artillery, and mechanized infantry overwhelmed the thin German defenses. Peiper himself fought in these final battles, moving among his soldiers, attempting to rally resistance, but the physics of the situation were immutable. German forces simply lacked the numbers, firepower, and logistical support necessary to mount any meaningful defense against the full weight of American military power. By early April, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and American forces driving deeper from the west, German military command had essentially ceased to function as a unified entity. Regional commanders operated in isolation. Local officers made decisions without reference to higher authority, and the Wehrmacht transformed from an organized fighting force into a collection of desperate, isolated units engaged in a prolonged death struggle. Peiper continued to command his sector, continued to organize resistance, continued to issue orders, even as the structure around him dissolved into incoherence. The month of April 1945 was characterized by the strange compression of time that accompanies the final moments of any great structure's collapse. Days passed with surreal rapidity, each bringing news of fresh defeats, new Allied advances, the loss of territory and soldiers that could not be replenished. Peiper moved through this landscape with the composure of a professional soldier, maintaining his dignity and his authority, even as the legitimacy of both evaporated. He learned through military channels of Hitler's suicide in the bunker in Berlin, of the appointment of Admiral Karl Dönitz as Hitler's successor, of the fragmentation of German command into isolated fiefdoms fighting local battles against overwhelming odds. The broader strategic picture was now irrelevant. The only question that mattered was personal survival and the preservation of whatever military honor could be salvaged from the wreckage of the Third Reich. Peiper maintained his command authority until the moment when continued resistance became impossible, when his sector was surrounded, when ammunition ran out and no reinforcements were forthcoming. By the final week of April, American forces were advancing so rapidly that organized German resistance in many regions had become impossible. Peiper found himself leading a shrinking command of survivors, men who had endured the entire war from beginning to end, through victories and defeats, through the transformation of the Wehrmacht from master of Europe to vanquished army. He received orders to move his forces westward, toward the American lines rather than toward the Soviet forces approaching from the east, an indication that German high command understood the Soviets would show no mercy to surrendering German soldiers, while the Americans, despite the horrors of Malmedy and other incidents, represented the possibility of survival. Peiper organized this final movement with characteristic precision, gathering his remaining soldiers and such equipment and vehicles as remained functional, and began the desperate march westward through territory that was no longer Germany's to control. The roads were filled with refugees, displaced persons, and other German soldiers similarly attempting to reach American lines before the Soviets closed in from the east. The organization and discipline that Peiper had maintained throughout the war, even in defeat, held together even as the nation itself fell apart around him. The final battles of April 1945 were fought in a world of utter devastation. German towns burned from Allied air raids, their populations either dead, displaced, or huddled in cellars and basements. Farmland lay fallow or was scarred by the passage of armies. Bridges were destroyed, roads cratered by artillery, the entire infrastructure of civilian life dismantled by 4 years of relentless warfare and the final months of rapid advance by Allied forces. Peiper's unit fought one last engagement with American forces near the Danube River in May, a brief tactical success that was utterly meaningless in the broader context of the war's final days. His soldiers inflicted casualties on the Americans, captured some prisoners, held a position for a matter of hours, and then withdrew as American firepower and numbers overwhelmed the small German force. This engagement would be among the final combats of the European War, a microscopic chapter in a history of unprecedented destruction and death. When it ended, Peiper and his surviving soldiers had nowhere left to retreat to. German territory was collapsing on all sides, Soviet forces were closing from the east, American forces surrounded them from the north and west. The moment of surrender came in early May 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final days. Peiper, now a major, made the decision that countless German officers faced in that final week, whether to fight to the death, to attempt to escape to neutral territory, or to surrender to forces that represented the hope of survival. He chose surrender to the Americans, understanding perhaps that the Soviets would exact a far harsher reckoning for a German officer of his rank and prominence. His soldiers laid down their weapons, abandoned their positions, and submitted to capture by American forces who were by that point processing thousands of German prisoners daily. The transition from commander of forces to prisoner of war was sudden and absolute. Peiper went from issuing orders that others were obligated to obey to a state of complete powerlessness, subject to the will of his captors. He was segregated from ordinary German prisoners because of his SS rank and his role in the Ardennes Offensive, and he was immediately subjected to interrogation about his command, his actions, and particularly the massacre at Malmedy that had occurred 6 months earlier during the failed breakthrough offensive. Peiper's surrender came as the entire German military structure simultaneously collapsed. In the same days and weeks when he laid down his weapons, German armies across the continent were surrendering in massive numbers, millions of soldiers entering captivity, countless officers walking away from the remnants of units that had simply ceased to exist as organized entities. The scale of the German military catastrophe was beyond easy comprehension. Armies that had conquered nations now surrendered wholesale. The vast machinery of the Wehrmacht reduced to scattered groups of exhausted survivors seeking shelter and safety from an approaching enemy that would show them no mercy if they fell into Soviet hands. Peiper's personal story was now complete in one sense. He had survived the war, had led men through victory and defeat, had been instrumental in some of the war's most aggressive offensives, and had lived to see the total collapse of the system he had served. Yet the war's ultimate judgment had not yet been rendered. He faced interrogation, trial, and the possibility of execution for the atrocities committed under his command. His surrender in May 1945 marked not the end of his war, but the beginning of a reckoning that would consume the remainder of his life and beyond. The final collapse of German military authority was so complete and sudden that soldiers in scattered units across the continent often surrendered without clear orders to do so, responding instead to the simple reality that further resistance was meaningless. Peiper was among tens of thousands of German officers who entered Allied captivity in those final weeks. and his initial treatment was that of a prisoner of war, subject to the Geneva Convention's protections. However, the investigation into the Malmedy massacre and other alleged atrocities had already begun among Allied intelligence services, and Peiper quickly became aware that his status might change from prisoner of war to war crimes suspect. The implications were stark. Prisoners of war faced a future of detention camps, eventual repatriation, and the possibility of rebuilding lives, while war crimes suspects faced interrogation, trial, and the very real possibility of execution. Peiper maintained his composure and dignity, even as this reality became apparent. He was still a soldier, accustomed to accepting orders and living with consequences, and he understood that this final phase of his war, the legal and moral reckoning, was now beginning. As May 1945 turned into June, with the European war officially concluded and the machinery of military justice beginning to operate, Peiper was transferred to a secure facility where he would begin the long process of facing the accusations that would define the remainder of his life. The war had ended, but for Joachim Peiper, the reckoning was only beginning. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across Germany and the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash, Peiper had surrendered to American captors with the knowledge that his name was already circulating among investigators and intelligence officers. The Malmedy massacre had not been forgotten. In fact, it had become the focal point of a massive intelligence effort to document German war crimes and identify those responsible. Peiper's role as commander of the column that had inflicted this atrocity made him a priority target for prosecution. He spent the months following his capture in various detention facilities, including camps where he was interrogated repeatedly about his movements, his orders, and his knowledge of what had transpired on the 17th of December 1944. The American military justice system was preparing to hold him accountable in a way that the chaos of war had made impossible. The trial itself began in November of 1946 at Dachau, a location that carried its own terrible weight in the historical record. Dachau had been a concentration camp, and now it served as the venue for military tribunals examining the crimes committed by Nazi officers and soldiers. Peiper appeared before a military court composed of American officers, and the proceedings were meticulous and formal. The prosecution, led by experienced military lawyers, had assembled extensive evidence documenting the events of the Ardennes Offensive. Witness statements from American survivors who had escaped the massacre, from German soldiers who had participated or witnessed the killings, and from local Belgian civilians who had observed the brutality of Peiper's advance, all formed a web of testimony that painted a damning picture. The court had access to documents captured from German military archives, orders that had been issued, and intelligence reports compiled in the immediate aftermath of the Malmedy incident. The case against Peiper was not built on speculation or assumption. It rested on documented fact and corroborated accounts. The evidence presented during the trial revealed the systematic nature of the killings at Malmedy. The prosecution demonstrated that approximately 80 American prisoners had been gunned down in a field after their surrender, that other American soldiers had been killed in subsequent incidents as Peiper's column advanced through Belgium, and that German soldiers under Peiper's command had committed additional atrocities against Belgian civilians and captured soldiers throughout the operation. What emerged from the testimony was not a picture of isolated, chaotic moments of warfare. It was a pattern of deliberate violence against those who were defenseless. German witnesses testified to receiving orders that prioritized speed and momentum, that emphasized eliminating obstacles to forward movement, and that created an atmosphere in which killing prisoners became an accepted practice rather than an aberration. Some German soldiers claimed they had been given explicit instructions to take no prisoners, though this remained a point of genuine contention. The prosecution argued convincingly that regardless of the specific nature of orders, Peiper bore ultimate responsibility for the conduct of his men as their commander. The defense mounted by Peiper's legal team focused on several key arguments that would shape the trial's narrative and complicate its clarity. Peiper himself testified, presenting himself as a soldier who had executed military orders within the framework of the Ardennes Offensive, not as a man who had deliberately orchestrated a massacre. He acknowledged the deaths at Malmedy, but claimed that he had not directly ordered the killing of prisoners, and that the chaos of combat, the pressure to maintain momentum, and the friction inherent in mechanized warfare had created conditions in which tragic incidents had occurred. His lawyers argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial in places, that some witness testimony had been coerced or was unreliable, and that the tribunal was judging military decisions made under extreme pressure by applying peacetime standards of justice. They presented character witnesses who testified to Peiper's professionalism and capability as a soldier, seeking to draw a distinction between military aggressiveness and criminal intent. They also questioned whether Peiper could be held responsible for the independent actions of individual soldiers under his command, or whether the responsibility lay further up the chain of command with officers who had issued the orders that set the operation in motion. The testimony of survivors became the emotional and moral anchor of the prosecution's case. Men who had been present at Malmedy when the shooting began, who had witnessed their friends and comrades cut down by machine gun fire while in captivity, now stood in court and recounted those moments with the vividness that trauma preserves in memory. They described the surrender, the disarming, the movement of prisoners toward the field, and then the opening of fire from German positions. Some survivors had played dead, had lain among corpses as the shooting continued, and had crawled away in the darkness to eventually reach American lines or be rescued by advancing units. Their presence in court was a moral and historical counterweight to any abstract arguments about military necessity or the fog of war. They represented the human reality beneath Peiper's operational decisions and tactical maneuvers. The jury of American officers heard directly from men who had suffered because of what had happened under Peiper's command, and this testimony shaped how they would ultimately evaluate the evidence and reach their verdict. German soldiers who had been part of Peiper's command and who were captured later also testified, and their accounts revealed both complicity and complexity. Some confirmed that prisoners had been killed after surrendering and described the orders or atmosphere that had permitted this to happen. Others expressed horror at what they had witnessed or participated in, suggesting that not all of Peiper's men had been willing killers, and that some had acted under duress or mob pressure. The testimony of German witnesses complicated the narrative. It was not a simple tale of evil commander ordering evil soldiers to commit atrocities. Rather, it emerged as a more nuanced and troubling picture in which military culture, ideological commitment, fear, peer pressure, and explicit or implicit acceptance of violence against enemies had combined to produce atrocity. Peiper's role in creating the conditions under which this had occurred, in maintaining a command atmosphere where such killing became possible, and in bearing ultimate responsibility for his unit's actions, became the central question for the tribunal. The trial also examined the broader context of the Ardennes Offensive and the SS ideology that infused the units under Peiper's command. The prosecution presented evidence that the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, like other SS formations, had been indoctrinated with a more radical and uncompromising view of warfare than regular Wehrmacht units. The SS had been the vanguard of Nazi ideological commitment, and its soldiers had been taught to view the enemy with particular hostility and to conduct warfare without the restraints that military tradition and the laws of war ordinarily imposed. This background made Peiper's leadership of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment particularly significant. He commanded an elite unit composed of committed Nazis, and the massacre at Malmedy did not emerge from vacuum, but from the ideological and military culture that defined SS service. The prosecution argued that this context made Peiper's responsibility even greater, that he had led an ideologically motivated force into a situation where atrocity became inevitable, given the attitudes and worldview of his men. The legal and moral questions raised by the trial extended beyond Peiper's individual responsibility to encompass larger questions about military command and criminal accountability. The tribunal had to grapple with the extent to which a commander could be held responsible for the actions of soldiers under his command when he had not personally ordered specific killings. The principle of command responsibility suggested that a commander must ensure the discipline and legality of his unit's conduct, that ignorance of crimes is not a defense, and that the failure to prevent or punish violations of the laws of war constitutes a form of complicity. Applied to Peiper, this principle suggested that whether or not he had explicitly ordered the Malmedy massacre, he bore responsibility for it, because his command environment had permitted it, and his leadership had set the conditions under which it occurred. This was a significant legal innovation, not merely prosecuting those who had pulled triggers, but holding the commander responsible for the broader pattern of unlawful conduct that his military authority encompassed. The trial proceeded through weeks of testimony, examination and cross-examination, presentation of documents, and legal argument. The tribunal heard from military experts about the scope of the Ardennes Offensive, the operational pressures that units like Peiper's faced, and the technical realities of commanding large formations in fast-moving combat. They heard from forensic experts who examined the physical evidence at Malmedy and other massacre sites. They heard from historians and intelligence officers who provided context about German military culture and the SS specifically. Each layer of testimony and evidence contributed to a comprehensive understanding of what had occurred and why. The prosecution and defense offered their closing arguments, summarizing the evidence and urging the tribunal to reach conclusions that aligned with their interpretation of the facts and the law. The courtroom at Dachau became a space where military history, moral reckoning, and legal accountability intersected. The trial of Joachim Peiper was not conducted in isolation. It was part of the larger Allied effort to hold Nazi leaders, military officers, and functionaries accountable for crimes committed during the war. The Nuremberg trials of top Nazi leadership had created a precedent for war crimes prosecution, and had established a legal framework for evaluating military conduct against international law and the laws of war. Peiper's trial at Dachau operated within that framework, but focused specifically on crimes committed during military operations rather than crimes of state or crimes against humanity on a systemic scale. This made it a different kind of case in some respects, but no less significant. The tribunal recognized that the prosecution of individuals who had committed atrocities in the field was essential to establishing that military conduct would be judged by objective standards, and that no military necessity could justify the slaughter of defenseless prisoners. Without such trials, the laws of war would become merely guidelines that could be ignored with impunity whenever military advantage seemed to depend on doing so. The atmosphere in the courtroom during the trial reflected the weight of what was being decided. The American officers serving as jurors understood that they were not simply judging one man's actions. They were defining the boundaries of military conduct and the consequences of crossing them. Peiper sat in the dock, listening to testimony about the deaths of American soldiers and Belgian civilians, testimony that directly connected his command decisions to the suffering of real human beings. The contrast between his appearance in court, composed, dressed in military uniform, presenting himself as a professional soldier, and the brutal reality of what had occurred under his command was stark. The trial forced a confrontation with the reality that military professionalism could coexist with, and in fact facilitate, atrocity. A man who had demonstrated tactical skill, personal bravery, and professional competence could also be directly responsible for mass killing. This uncomfortable truth hung over the proceedings, complicating any simple narrative of either his guilt or the nature of military responsibility. As the trial drew toward its conclusion, the evidence accumulated, and the pattern became unmistakable to those judging the case. The prosecution had established beyond reasonable doubt that Peiper's column had perpetrated massacre at Malmedy, that American prisoners had been deliberately killed after surrendering, and that other atrocities had occurred under Peiper's command during the Ardennes Offensive. The defense had not successfully refuted these basic facts. They had instead focused on disputing the degree to which Peiper bore personal responsibility for what his subordinates had done, and whether the circumstances of war justified consideration of military necessity as a mitigating factor. The tribunal would have to weigh these considerations and determine not only what had happened, but what consequence Peiper would face for his role in it. The trial at Dachau was reaching its conclusion, but the questions it raised about justice, responsibility, and the limits of military conduct would continue to reverberate long after the verdict was delivered. The tribunal at Dachau reached its verdict in the summer of 1946. The proceedings had consumed months of testimony, cross-examination, and argument. Prosecutors had assembled a meticulous case built on documented evidence, sworn statements from survivors and witnesses, and the inescapable fact that men under Peiper's command had killed American prisoners. The judges, military officers appointed to adjudicate the gravest accusations, had heard from soldiers who survived the massacre, from fellow German officers who testified about the culture of the unit, and from experts who analyzed the mechanics of how the killings unfolded. The weight of testimony pointed in one direction. On the 28th of July 1946, the tribunal announced its finding. Joachim Peiper was guilty of war crimes. The sentence was death by hanging. In the weeks that followed, Peiper's defense team filed appeals, arguing procedural irregularities and questioning the reliability of certain witnesses. The case did not end cleanly. Questions began to surface in military circles and among legal observers about whether the trial had met the standards of justice that the victorious nations claimed to represent. These doubts would grow louder and more insistent as the years passed. The immediate aftermath of conviction was peculiar. Peiper did not hang. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still the sentence remained unexecuted. Appeals wound through the military justice system, each one delaying the moment of execution. Peiper sat in his cell at Landsberg prison, where many Nazi war criminals awaited their fate, living in a strange limbo between condemnation and clemency. Other men condemned at Nuremberg and Dachau were executed, their names fading into history. But Peiper remained alive, a persistent question mark in the record of post-war justice. His survival became, in its own way, as controversial as his conviction. Some saw in this delay evidence of bias or favoritism. Others argued that lingering legal questions deserved serious examination. The American military, which had conducted the trial, began to face criticism from unexpected quarters. German public opinion, initially suppressed and controlled in the immediate aftermath of defeat, gradually reasserted itself, and some Germans began to view Peiper as a scapegoat for broader military decisions made at higher levels